Hello and welcome everyone to today's live stream. Today we're going to be covering chapter 4 of our compendium. This is the first chapter of the Revolutionary Era. And this chapter, called Join or Die, covers the years 1763 to 1775. So these are the 12 years leading up to the American Revolution, which will be chapter 5, which I'll discuss tomorrow on July 4th. And so today we're just going to be covering this chapter. And this chapter is, you can tag along and look at this page on our website, www.tarpeia.us. This is chapter 4 of the compendium. And each chapter has its own dedicated page, like what you see here. And each chapter is divided into sections. And so each section, like what you see here, has its own interactive timeline that consists of primary source documents and events of the period. And so this chapter is divided into 3 sections, and we're going to start with the first section. And so this section covers the years 1763 to 1766. This is the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War. In Europe, the conflict is the 7 Years' War, but we're primarily focusing on the North American perspective. So, getting into the details, we try to explain all of the different treaties and alliances and all the important battles and all the important sides of the 7 Years' War in Europe in the previous chapter, which covered the French and Indian War as the fourth intercolonial war. And keeping track of European alliances is a challenge in itself. So we're just sticking to the North American colonial perspective of the war and the aftermath as well, and the English perspective. And so the very beginning of this section, and the first event of this chapter, is the start of George Grenville's as Prime Minister of England. So in previous chapters, we kept track of who is the King of England, France, Spain, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, who is the Pope, because knowing those people and knowing how they're related to each other and the alliances that they've formed is very important in understanding all of the wars that were fought in the previous chapters. Well, now that we're focusing in on the English North American colonies, we're no longer going to be keeping track of the kings, since this is a very short time period. This is only 12 years. The last chapter was over 70 years. The chapter before that was also 70 years, and then the first chapter was over 100 years. So keeping track of who's monarch was important for the previous 3 chapters because you're covering a very long time span. Now that we're focusing in on a short time span, only 12 years, there aren't really any changes for the monarchs. So King George III is going to be the King of England throughout this entire chapter and the next chapter. Who's King of France is going to be pretty much the same. King of Spain, pretty much the same, and stuff like that. So instead of keeping track of who's monarch, we're now going to be keeping track of who is prime minister, because just as keeping track of the monarchs in previous chapters was important for understanding the alliances and the wars, understanding who and keeping track of who is the prime minister is going to be important for the American colonies, because each prime minister will have their own perspective, have their own policies that they're going to try to implement, have their own ideas of how to reconcile with the colonies, and also deal with the massive war debt that England has thanks to almost a century of non-stop fighting with the European powers. And so, especially the cost of the French and Indian War. And so this is the start of George Grenville. He becomes prime minister during his reign, or tenure, as prime minister from 1763 to 1765. He sought to consolidate British control over the American colonies and raised revenue to pay off debts from the 7 Years' War, leading to the passage of controversial measures such as the Sugar Act, which we'll go into more detail of, and the Stamp Act of 1765, which this section covers. Grenville viewed these acts as fair and necessary contributions from the colonies toward their own defense, but they sparked widespread colonial protest, starting the cycle of acts, petitions, and reprisals, which define this chapter. And so, acts, petitions, and reprisals used to have been the name of this chapter, and then I changed it to Join or Die. And this is really a cyclical thing where Parliament will pass acts, the colonies will send petitions to repeal those acts, and then Parliament will react with even more acts. So that's the acts, petitions, and reprisals. Again, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, King George will give this speech to Parliament praising the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And it is this speech which will be criticized by a member of Parliament, a guy named John Wilkes. He criticizes the speech for praising the treaty, and Wilkes will be charged with libel, accusing the king of lying, and imprisoned for a short time in the Tower of London. And so the John Wilkes controversy is a free speech controversy that's happening in London, and news of this will reach the Americas as fear of the right to criticize your own government will spark lots of suspicion from the colonists. If they're arresting their own members of Parliament, what's stopping them from arresting the common folk for criticizing the government? And so this is an early sign of the British going a little too far, as they always do, when it comes to restricting free speech, which will cause suspicion in the colonies. Following the end of the French involvement in fighting the British, the Native Americans, who were not told what the Treaty of Paris was about, believed that the French were going to continue fighting. And so Pontiac, he organizes at an intertribal war council, and we actually have a speech because some French colonists were there to witness it, and they wrote at least excerpts of it down to the best of their ability. And so in Pontiac's speech, he believed that the French were going to continue fighting, and so he's rallying the Native Americans to continue fighting the British. And so this is the start of what people call Pontiac's Rebellion. It's not really his own rebellion. He's not like the king of Native Americans. He's just leading a coalition of French allied native tribes to continue the fighting from the French and Indian War into the post-French and Indian War. And so there's other coalitions of Native Americans because Pontiac isn't popular everywhere, and they will have competing interests. Some of them will surrender and make treaties with the British early in the conflict. Some will continue fighting long after Pontiac surrenders. And so Pontiac, even though we name it after Pontiac, he's not the only leader, and not all Native Americans are rallied behind him. He's just a coalition leader of a small Native American coalition. And so during this time, and really because of the Calvinist revival, which people call the First Great Awakening, the religious figures in the American colonies start to publish essays or treatises in a form of like a sermon. It's like a written down sermon for people to read and to express their ideas about the separation of church and state. You have to keep in mind, under the British Empire, they are under the Church of England, but not everyone in the British Empire are Anglican. You have Presbyterians, You have um, Baptists, you have Puritans, you have this wide range of Protestants, of English Protestants. I mean, you have some Catholics too, living in the American colonies. And so, as the king and parliament are increasing authority over their enforcement of their authority over the English colonies, many of the religious leaders outside of the Church of England are concerned that the king and parliament are going to force them to be more Anglican, because in England there were many restrictions against these people, against Baptists, against Presbyterians, against Puritans, in favor of the Anglicans and the Episcopalians. Um, and so these religious leaders in the colonies will start to debate each other on the issues of church and state. And they're going to be debating each other through writing essays in and publishing them in newspapers. This will be taken up by political leaders during this section, debating political issues. So the use of newspapers to express ideas, to critique and criticize the government, and spread awareness of their concerns as religious leaders outside the Church of England, that media, using newspapers to convey ideas, will be taken up by non-religious leaders, by political leaders, by lawyers, by assemblymen in the colonial assemblies, the legislatures of the colonies, for debating and criticizing the government on political issues. So it's interesting to see the transition, this evolution of conveying information, of this media, go from a religious context more into the political context in this very timeline, in this section. And we have a couple battles. We add events to the timeline to provide context to what's going on. So you have the Siege of Fort Detroit. This is during Pontiac's Rebellion. Battle of Point Pelee, stopped by the Native Americans trying to lift the Siege of Fort Detroit. You have the Siege of Fort Pitt. That's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You have the Enoch Brown School Massacre, where 4 Delaware or Lenape Native Americans entered a settler's log schoolhouse in the province of Pennsylvania and killed the schoolmaster, Enoch Brown, and 10 students. So this is yet another massacre committed by Native Americans against the colonists. If you were there for the first 3 chapters, the past 3 days that I've been doing these live streams, we are trying to add as many of these incidences as possible to these timelines. And it's not just Native Americans massacring colonists, it's Native Americans massacring other Native Americans. One of the first school massacres is during the Jamestown, during during the Powhatan, Anglo-Powhatan Wars. One of the very first school massacres in America was Native Americans massacring a mixed school of the European English colonists and Native Americans who were both being taught in that college. And so school massacres are one of the first massacres against English colonists by Native Americans, along with other massacres like the Jamestown Massacre. And so this is just the continuance of a very, very long and bloody history of massacres. There will be reprisals by the colonists. They, during Pontiac's Rebellion, will go around killing Native Americans who had nothing to do with Pontiac's Rebellion, had nothing to do with the Enoch Brown School Massacre. And so that, yet again, continues the cycle of violence against non-combatants, against civilians, people who had nothing to do with the violence. And we're going to be including that in the timeline. We do have it on the timeline. Here's the Battle of Bloody Run, the Battle of Bushy Run, Devil's Hole Massacre. And by the time you get to the Royal Proclamation at the end of 1763, most of the fighting in Pontiac's rebellion is pretty much over. There's still going to be skirmishes happening, but all of these major sieges and battles are pretty much over by this point. So the fighting itself only lasts a couple of months, from May to around November, December of 1763. And as you can see on the timeline, on October 7th, 1763, the king issues a royal proclamation for limiting the boundaries of the colonies. Now, there's a couple misconceptions that I always hear when people talk about the royal proclamation of colonial boundaries. It did not ban the colonies from expanding. It limited how the colonies can expand. It cannot expand into allied native territories. Whenever I hear other people, like other educators, talk about this, they say that the colonies cannot expand to any native territories. No, it specifically says allied native territories. And if you know anything about this time period, most native tribes are not allied with the British. Most native tribes are allied with the French. And so this protection of native land does not apply to most Native Americans. And also, it doesn't ban the purchasing of native allied lands. It only restricts it to where you have to get permission to buy the land from the royal governors. And so the royal governors can still just allow the purchase to happen. So this wasn't really all that much of a restriction. And also there was numerous, proclamations and restrictions like this in British history. All the treaties with all the Native Americans, each one limited the expansion of the colonies, but then each one was broken by the British. So a lot of people say, oh, well, America made all these treaties, and then we broke all the treaties. Where do you think we got that tradition of breaking treaties with Native Americans from? We got it from the British. The British would make a treaty, and then something will happen, most likely by the fault of the British, that will start a war and annul the treaty, and then the British will take more land and then make a new treaty that will expand the territory of Britain, and Britain will do this over and over and over again. So, the idea that the British actually cared about Native Americans is pretty laughable. They absolutely hated Native Americans, especially the British aristocracy and the generals. The British generals. I mean, there was an infamous British general during this time, and I'm going to have to add him to the timeline. He fought in the French and Indian War, and he'll be in charge of fighting in Pontiac's rebellion. And he absolutely despises Native Americans and says a lot of very choice words about them, calling them savages and whatnot. And so the idea that the British were concerned about Native Americans and it's only the American colonists who were angry or didn't like the Native Americans is simply not true. The British from Britain, from England, did not like Native Americans, almost more so than the colonists. If you read the rhetoric of a lot of the colonists, especially like the Quaker type colonists, like from Pennsylvania and Benjamin Franklin, they have a lot of respect for the Native Americans. It's the British aristocratic generals from England who don't like the Native Americans more so than the colonists. So this document does not actually protect native land. It actually gives a bunch of territory to British officers. So that kind of contradicts the idea that this is to protect native land. No, it's actively handing out land like candy to the British officers who fought in the French and Indian War. And so, yeah, this document is not as insightful or incendiary as people like to make it out to be. If you read the petitions by the colonies complaining about British policy, this is not really one of the documents that the colonists themselves complain about. It's popular today in our own historiography in how this time period is taught, but if you read the primary sources, they're not really complaining about this proclamation, mainly because this proclamation was not really being enforced all that much. Um, you will have some mentions of it, but it's by far not the most incendiary document from Parliament. I will show you that document pretty soon. Here's yet another religious essay written by Jonathan Mayhew, and again, this guy, he is complaining about the Anglican Society for the propagation of the gospel, and he's concerned that New England churches, like the Congregationalists, are going to be replaced by Anglican society. And so this is, again, the religious debate. And you're going to start to see during this time period, during this section, that the use of newspapers and essays through newspapers is going to transition from religious issues to more political and economic issues. And it's interesting to see that transition. Here's an interesting incident that happens, which is the the Parsons Cause case. And so this issue is on the Two Penny Act, which I talked about in the last chapter, which was passed during the French and Indian War, and it was a law passed by the House of Burgesses of Virginia to fix the salary of the Anglican pastors. And so the Anglican pastors at that time were being paid not with money, because there's a scarcity of money in the colonies. They were being paid by a certain amount of tobacco. And then whatever the market value of the tobacco was, the priest can sell the tobacco, and that would be how they got their salary. So priests were being paid in tobacco in Virginia. However, during the French and Indian War, because of all the fighting that disrupted the production of tobacco, the demand, or the supply of tobacco, went down, while demand pretty much stayed the same, or maybe even went up, and this increased the value of tobacco. And so the same amount of tobacco was much more valuable. And so the House of Burgesses of Virginia wanted to fix the salaries at 2 pence a pound or something like that of tobacco. That's why it's called the Two Penny Act. And many Anglican reverends complained about this. And so this is Reverend James Murray. He brought suit against the vestry for his back pay and won. At that point, a novice attorney, Patrick Henry, was asked to argue the vestry's side when the jury convened to determine how much Reverend Murray should be paid. The presiding judge was Colonel John Henry, Patrick Henry's father. In a fervent oration, Henry criticized the established clergy, the Anglicans, and challenged British authority, wherein Patrick Henry committed treason in his moments of dramatic oratory. Patrick Henry persuaded the jurors that Murray was opposed at the beginning to grant token damages of only 1 penny for the clergy. Henry's victory in the Parsons Cause enhanced his legal practice and launched a political career. He was fortunate all clergy members did not gather together and petition the king, including charges of Henry's words of treason, such as calling the king a tyrant. And so what's going on is James Murray, an Anglican reverend, he will sue to get paid more than the Two Penny Act was giving, because he wanted to get paid in the tobacco and then sell it at the high market value of the tobacco. And so the court ruled in favor of the Reverend James Murray, but then a separate jury would needed to determine how much of that back pay was owed. And this is when Patrick Henry, he comes in and he argues that sure, James Murray deserves back pay, but we're only going to pay him 1 penny of back pay. And again, it's impressive that James Murray and the other clergy, the Anglican clergy, did not bring this issue up to Parliament. I'll have to do more research as to why not. But as you can see, this religious issue regarding the Church of England and its authority within the colonies will morph from a religious issue into a more political issue. And Patrick Henry is one of the first people to bring it from a religious issue to a political issue. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the English colonists in Pennsylvania, they will enact vengeance on Native Americans for incidences, for raids like the Enoch Brown School Massacre. However, they will kill Native Americans who had nothing to do with the massacre or with the broader Pontiac's rebellion. So this is yet another example of wanton violence against non-combatants, civilians, that was completely unnecessary. And the people who did this, the Paxton Boys, will actually be a target for the Pennsylvania government. And these guys will actually try to raid Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and it's Benjamin Franklin who will stop them, which is interesting. Here's yet another political and religious essay by Thomas Seeker, responding to Dr. Mayhew's observations. This primary source document before. And then here is one of the first political essays. So as I said before, the essay, the medium of newspapers and writing political essays will begin talking about religious issues, mainly the authority of the Church of England in the colonies. Now we're going to see a transition during this section away from religious issues to broader political issues. And Arthur Lee will be one of those people. This is one of the first political essays criticizing the British governmental policy. Here's a interesting essay on crimes and punishments, written by an Italian guy. And I like to add as many of these primary sources from not just the American colonies, but also in other parts of Europe. Like I include Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. I include John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. I include The Spirit of Law by Montesquieu. And now this is yet another political essay. And here's a primary source of the violence in Pennsylvania during Pontiac's Rebellion. And this is written by Benjamin Franklin, talking about the late massacres. So the Enoch Brown Massacre, and now the massacre by the Paxton Boys. And the Paxton Boys will threaten to burn down Philadelphia because some of the Native Americans will flee to Philly, seeking refuge. Paxton Boys will follow, and then threaten to burn down the city if the Native Americans are not given to them. Benjamin Franklin will meet with the Paxton Boys and convince them to stop the violence. And so this is a primary source document of that violence, that wanton violence that was happening in Pennsylvania during Pontiac's Rebellion. Here's John Wilkes. He is found guilty of libel. Remember at the start, John Wilkes is a member of Parliament. He will criticized the king for a speech that he gave about the Treaty of Paris of 1763, and James Wilkes, or John Wilkes, will be arrested, and this is an issue of freedom of speech. And so, we Americans like to pride ourselves as being the defenders of freedom of speech, but in England, there were people who were dealing with freedom of speech issues as well. So it's not just an American value, it's a British value, at least by the British people, not really by the king. The king and parliament do not really believe in freedom of speech because they arrest people that they don't like the speech of. Sound familiar? This is James Otis Jr. He debates taxation in the Massachusetts General Court. The colonies are now becoming more aware of British policy in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, as Britain will start to enforce more and more and pass many more acts to regulate the colonies, and so the colonies themselves will start to deliberate on what to do about this. How do we react to British encroachments of our authority to govern the colonies ourselves? And they're going to start at the local level and then the colonial level, and then they make their way up to the United Colonies level. And this chapter shows that progression. And so this is now from the local to the General Court of Massachusetts and Boston, which is the colonial level. And James Otis Jr., he becomes a very important early founder, early patriot. George Grenville, he is the prime minister, begins to discuss the stamp tax. And there are some representatives in Parliament, specifically the House of Commons, who are friends with American colonists, and so they're sending information back to the colonies. And so news of this Stamp Act will reach the colonies a year before the Stamp Act is actually passed, and many of the colonists and their colonial petitions will include the pending stamp tax. And so we'll see how that goes later in this very same section. On April 5th, 1764, the Sugar Act is passed. This placed duties on certain goods from the colonies, including sugar, molasses, rum, and a bunch of other products as well. So this is one of the first acts passed by Parliament. I mean, this is the first act passed by Parliament during this time, so post French and Indian War, where that will anger the American colonists. So the Sugar Act will be mentioned a lot in the early petitions. And then you also have the Currency Act of 1764. There was a previous Currency Act of 1751 or 52 in the previous chapter, and this Currency Act expanded that. That act pretty much only impacted the Pennsylvania colony, but now this act affects all the colonies. And what it did was it prohibited the American colonies from issuing their own paper money, and required that debts to British creditors be paid in gold and silver, and also any new duties or taxes will have to be paid using British pounds. And so this will devastate not only the Sugar Act, which greatly impacts production of commodities in the colonies, but then you have the Currency Act, which will just completely devastate the financial situation in the colonies, because the supply of British currency is very low in the colonies. There's a scarcity of British currency, and that's why the colonies relied on their own paper currency. But now, all the paper currency has been abolished, which greatly decreases the money supply, and you have a um a scarcity of British currency, and so they're not able to pay their debts. And because of the restriction on trade from the Sugar Act, the colonists cannot make that much money selling commodities. And so it's like, imagine restricting someone so they can't work, but then you take all their money and tell them that they have to pay you for the privilege of getting some supplies using a currency that they don't have. So this is just terrible economic policy to begin with. The Sugar Act limiting trade and production, and now the Currency Act, which causes a financial crisis in the colonies. So right off the bat, the British are screwing up the finances and the productivity of the colonies. This does not help their case at all. And it's after the passage of these early acts, the Sugar Act and the Currency Act, that James Otis Jr. will write this really important essay called The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved. And this will be a major influence for the next decade. And it is a major influence, I believe, for Thomas Jefferson, who will write a summary view of the rights of British America. Because it sounds very similar. The arguments in this essay are very similar to Thomas Jefferson's arguments. Of course, when Thomas Jefferson, he writes summary view of the rights of British America, he is writing as if that essay is actually a resolution for the Second Continental Congress to approve, for the Second Continental Congress to approve of and pass. And so James Otis, he's just writing an essay. It's not supposed to be a resolution, but Thomas Jefferson writes his essay as if it was a resolution. And that I have that essay later in the timeline. Not this timeline, but a later timeline within this chapter. And here is the instructions to Boston's representatives. And so you still have this local level politics where Boston's representatives in the Colonial Assembly are directing them to oppose the Sugar Act and other British imposed taxes. These instructions reflected growing colonial unity and the principle that Parliament should not tax the colonies without their consent. So now you go from local level to now the colonial level of complaining of sharing their grievances with Parliament about these policies, Sugar and Currency Act, and the pending Stamp Act. And like before, you had essays being written on religious issues. Now you have essays being written on political issues. So these are the Principles of Law and Polity by Francis Bernard. And he is going to be defending constitutional monarchy and parliamentary sovereignty and the authority of the imperial government within the British Empire. And so he's going to argue that the colonies are secure of their liberties by Britain, but the colonies are subordinate. So he's a loyalist writing a political essay. Here's another loyalist, Thomas Hutchinson. He is the governor of Massachusetts at this time, and he writes a brief state of the claim of the colonies. And so we do not just include political essays written by the patriots, the people who are grieving about all of these restrictions by Parliament. We're also including essays from loyalists, from people who say these restrictions are maybe not all good, but Parliament does have the authority to pass these regulations, the Sugar Act and the Currency Act and the pending Stamp Act. And so here's two primary source documents from the loyalist perspective of what they thought Parliament had the right to do. Here is a treaty, and the Native American treaties were wampum belts, which are these shells that are put on a string, and it looks like a belt. And so this is what the actual treaty looks. Or this is a recreation of what the treaty might have looked like for the Treaty of Fort Niagara, where the Senecas will sue for peace, and they will no longer be part of Pontiac's rebellion. Here's the Sentiments of a British American by Oxenbridge Thatcher, and he will criticize British policy. So here's another political essay written by a patriot, someone who criticizes the authority of Parliament. And now we finally get to the good, juicy part of this module, this first half of this timeline of this section, which is the colonial petitions themselves. So the colonies, the General Assemblies, they meet individually, and they will write these petitions. And I've gathered as many petitions as I can find, and these petitions are specifically against the Sugar Act. Some of them mention the Currency Act, and a few of them mention the Pending Stamp Act. So the first one that we have is New York's petition. And what's interesting about this petition is they counter the argument that Parliament makes, where these taxes are just a way for the colonies to pay their fair share. Like, the colonies are not paying enough in taxes, and therefore, they should pay their fair share for their own defense. In this petition, New York will argue that New York, during the French and Indian War, paid above and beyond its fair share. It suffered greatly when it comes to manpower. It suffered greatly when it comes to trade and their expenses. So much so that Parliament actually gave New York a tax rebate, some tax deductions, or like a tax returns, for contributing so much above and beyond what they were required in the French and Indian War. So Parliament cannot argue, at least for New York, they cannot argue that New York did not pay its fair share in the French and Indian War, therefore justifying these taxes, when Parliament recognized during the French and Indian War that New York contributed above and beyond what was required of them to contribute for the war effort. And so the whole idea that, the colonies are not paying their fair share in taxes, well, at least New York, they were paying their fair share of taxes. So much so that Parliament recognized that they were paying above and beyond their fair share in taxes and the contributions to the French and Indian War. And so you have that perspective in this petition, but you also have the idea of representation, of taxation without representation. That's a big common idea. Most people today, when we think of this time period, we think of no taxation without representation. Well, in this petition, all the way back in 1764, New York, at least, is saying even if the colonies had representation in Parliament, they would still be against the taxes, because the taxes are just bad economic policy to begin with. So it's not just about representation. It's about sound economic policy. What's good for the colony? Is it really good for the colony to, in 2 acts, restrict production and restrict trade, and then in the next act, the Currency Act, to abolish the colonial currencies and cause a financial crisis? Are these really good policies? Even if the colonies had representatives in Parliament, they would still be against these policies. And New York argues that in this petition. Here's yet another political essay. This is by Richard Bland, and he's a patriot. He's going to be arguing against these policies, and he's directly responding to some of the loyalists who are defending the policies and the authority of Parliament. Here is Connecticut's petition, and they're going to do something similar with New York, although they're going to be focusing on the idea of British rights. The rights of Englishmen is a common phrase used at this time, and this is drafted by Governor Thomas Fitch of Connecticut. Here is Massachusetts' petition, and again, they're going to argue that the idea of English rights is being violated by the Sugar Act, by the Currency Act, and by the pending Stamp Act. Stamp Act is not yet passed, but news of it being, going through Parliament has reached the colonies, and so the colonies are proactively complaining about the Stamp Act, while they're complaining about the Sugar Act and the Currency Acts. And then you have Rhode Island's petition of the Sugar and Currency Acts. And for each of these primary source documents, we have a button, the Read Document button. You click on that, and it takes you to the full text of these petitions. So if you want to read them for yourself, you can on our website. Here is another Patriot essay, and I call these essays the Liberty Essays. And they're written by patriots, and they are talking about the rights of Englishmen and how they should be treated by Parliament, and that Parliament, its power ought to be limited, and that they do not have a prerogative over the colonies. And then here's Virginia's petition, and they're mostly going to focus on the idea of representation without taxation, and they're going to be complaining about the Stamp Act that's pending. Now you have the commentaries on the laws of England. This is a very important document. It's written by William Blackstone, and it is going to be very influential when it comes to the rights of Englishmen and just British law in general. And many lawyers, pretty much all lawyers at this time in England, are going to be reading this book. And so John Adams will read this book, and this would be one of his favorite books. And John Adams during this time is a amateur lawyer, and so this is a very influential book. Now we get into the stamp crisis, the crisis around the Stamp Act itself. Grenville, who is Prime Minister of England right now, he will propose the Stamp Act on February 6, 1765, and talks about the Stamp Act has been going on for a year at this point, but now it's an official bill going through Parliament. And so for the next the next month, you're going to have debates in Parliament. And right now we only have one excerpt from these debates. I will be adding more about these debates, and the one excerpt that we have right now is from Isaac Barr. He's a member of Parliament, and he's going to coin the term Sons of Liberty. So the idea of the Sons of Liberty is actually a term invented by Parliament talking about the American colonists. And during the debate on the Stamp Act, no less. And Isaac Barr and a few other many members of Parliament are against the Stamp Act. So how this history is taught, you have people saying that, it's just Parliament imposing all these policies on the American colonies, and Parliament does not care. Most members of Parliament, many members, especially the Whigs, are going to be in favor of colonial rights, in favor of colonial representation in Parliament, and against a lot of these policies that are passed. So Parliament itself was very divided. That is an aspect of this time period that most educators, most teachers leave out. Parliament was not 100% on board with all these policies. The Stamp Act just barely gets passed, and it quickly gets repealed before it even goes into effect. So Parliament is not like on like a monolith, like one side. No, it's very diverse politically, and different members of Parliament from different parties, mostly the Whigs, will support the colonial cause. And this division in Parliament will continue even into the War for Independence, where the Whigs, especially, are going to be opposed to sending large armies to the American colonies. So you wonder why Britain was only sending very small armies. It was because many members of Parliament were against sending large armies to the Americas. So that has a major impact on the success of America in the American Revolution. The fact that members of Parliament did not want to fight American colonists. That's an aspect that most people leave out when they talk about this history. And we know Britain had the armies, millions of soldiers, because shortly after the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution and the Wars of the Coalitions and the Napoleonic Wars that include millions upon millions of soldiers all over Europe. And England will be a belligerent power in those conflicts, which only start like a decade after the American Revolution. And so Britain had the military force. They had the greatest navy in the world, and they had a very large, very professional army that they could have sent to the Americas. Why didn't they? Well, because most of Parliament was against it. So that's an aspect that is not talked about, and this division in Parliament might also lead to why the American Revolution happened in the first place, because Parliament is flip-flopping from harsh punishment to repealing that punishment to then replacing that with different harsh punishment. And so you have this cycle of acts from Parliament, petitions or complaining from the American colonies, and then some repeals, but then even more acts from Parliament. And so this cycle of, this repeating cycle of these acts being passed by Parliament and then repealed, and then it causes chaos, it causes uncertainty and suspicion and fear and paranoia that will grow within the American colonies until we had enough of the nonsense and we just rebelled. So it probably would have been best for Parliament side and for maintaining the empire if they stuck to a policy and didn't respect our repeals of it, but then added us into the representative body of Parliament, which most members, maybe not most, but a very large portion of Parliament, especially the Whigs, were okay with. They wanted the colonies to be represented in Parliament anyway. And so, it's just bad policy, bad politics, and bad timing, and bad enforcement of these policies that lead to the American Revolution. So, that was just me going on a rant about British Parliament. Let's go back into the primary sources. So this is the Stamp Act, and this required that many printed materials in the American colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, and playing cards, to carry a tax stamp authorized by Britain. So every single piece of paper pretty much had to have a stamp on it, and then those stamps were taxed. And that's how they raised the tax revenue, was because people had to pay to buy the stamps. And so the act sparked widespread colonial protest, uniting diverse groups in opposition to taxation without representation and questioning Parliament's authority. And so before this, with the Sugar Act and the Currency Act, during the sugar crisis, most of the colonies are sending their own petitions independently. They're not working together on writing these petitions. New York sends their own petition, Connecticut sends their own petition, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Virginia. All these colonies are complaining on their own, independently from each other. with the passage of the Stamp Act, this convinces the colonies to not send petitions individually, but to instead congress, which means to gather, congress, and write a petition as a united front against Parliament. And so the Stamp Act will lead to what will become known as the Stamp Act Congress. Congress, to gather. That's what Congress means. Also, a very important, if anything, this act, the Quartering Act of 1765, not to be confused with the Quartering Act during the Intolerable Acts. There's a separate Quartering Act as part of the 5 Intolerable Acts. This Quartering Act specifically targeted New York because that was the headquarters for the British military force in North America, in Albany, or Albany, and then also New York City, and so New York will refuse to enforce the Quartering Act, and this Quartering Act forced New York to provide housing or quarters, to provide clothes, ammunition, food, water, transportation, and all these things. And New York, the colony of New York, will refuse to give all these things to the soldiers. This will lead, and I will show you on the timeline, to Parliament revoking the New York colony, of abolishing the General Assembly of New York. Ironically, New York will concede and follow this act before news of the abolishment of the New York General Assembly reaches the colonies. And so Parliament quickly rescinds the revoking of the New York colony, but news of it reached the colonies too late, and the colonies freak out. So the Quartering Act of 1765 is even more incendiary than the Stamp Act itself. The Stamp Act doesn't even go into effect and doesn't have any real impact on the colonies. The Quartering Act and the reaction of Parliament to abolish the Colonial Assembly of New York for refusing, at least temporarily, to enforce the Quartering Act, that very event will be mentioned in the Declaration of Independence when it talks about the General Assemblies being abolished by Parliament and the King. And so this act is even more of an inciting event for the American Revolution than the Stamp Act, even though most historians, when they talk about this time period, the stamp crisis, they always miss out on this act, even though it had an even greater long-lasting impact than the Stamp Act did. So this is why primary sources are very important, because if you just rely on non-primary sources, you're already getting a summary, and they leave a bunch of stuff out. And then if you continue that tradition of just summarizing, eventually you're leaving so much stuff out that you no longer have a clear understanding of what happened in the past. And so relying and looking towards primary sources is very important. And that's the whole point of our project, is to make the primary sources known, but also provide the full text of each of these documents so that you guys can study it. And so here is the proposed Virginia resolutions responding to the Stamp Act. It was drafted by Patrick Henry. So the House of Burgesses, which is the Virginia General Assembly of the colony of Virginia, debated a series of resolutions drafted by Patrick Henry, asserting that Virginians possessed the same rights as Englishmen and could only be taxed by their own elected representatives. The resolves challenged Parliament's authority to levy internal taxes, which they called the Stamp Act as an internal tax, as opposed to most of the duties, which are external taxes. Taxes on trade is basically just a tariff or a tax on, like a sales tax. And then these resolves challenged Parliament's authority to levy internal taxes on the colonies and declared that the House of Burgesses alone held the right to tax the people of Virginia, although some of Henry's more radical resolutions were rejected or later rescinded. Their publication throughout the colonies helped galvanize resistance to the Stamp Act and popularize the principle of no taxation without representation. Now, the House of Burgesses passed 5 out of the 7 of Patrick Henry's resolutions, the fifth and most strident of them by only 1 vote. Here is the Massachusetts Circular Letter of 1765, and we don't have an image of it, but we do have the text of it. And this is the Massachusetts General Court adopts a circular letter asking the rest of the colonies for a Stamp Act Congress to convene in New York in October. So Massachusetts is the one to send a circular letter, which is just a public letter, an open letter, asking the other colonies to join Massachusetts in New York to have a Congress. Again, Congress just means to gather and talk about the Stamp Act and how they're going to address Parliament as a united front. Here's a very famous essay called The Late Regulations. It's a pamphlet written by John Dickinson. John Dickinson will become, as many of these men will become, a founding father. Although he was against independence, so he was almost a loyalist. But after independence was passed, and his vote was, he abstained from voting for independence. After independence is passed, then he joined the revolution. So he was a reluctant patriot. He didn't want to secede from the British Empire, but after his state of Pennsylvania did, he decided to stick with Pennsylvania and not with the British Empire. And so people have very strong attachment to their colonial identity. And this very strong attachment to their colonial identity will continue long after the establishment of the United States as loyalty to state identity, which will have a major impact on the Civil War. But that's a much later chapter. That's like 9 chapters from now. And so, let's see, here's another document. The Board of Trade declares Henry's resolves, the one passed by Virginia, an attack on the Constitution. That's the British Constitution. Calling the resolves opposing the Stamp Act passed in May by the Virginia House of Burgesses an attack on the British Constitution. The Board of Trade recommends tough action by the Crown to enforce the Stamp Act and other laws. Also, the cabinet reports to King George III that opposition shown by the Virginians is a matter too important not to be left to Parliament. So now you have this advisory board called the Board of Trade, which is an advisory board to the king. This board will advocate for the king to take more interest and involvement in this imperial crisis. And so when the Declaration of Independence is passed on July 4th of 1776, you see the Declaration is blaming the king for all these things. Well, the king was getting more involved in the imperial crisis, and by the time of the start of the next chapter, which we'll talk about independence, the king has ended any peaceful path for reconciliation. The king himself issues a declaration of war when Parliament does not want a war and the colonists at that time don't want a war. No one wants a war, but the king is like, screw it, we're going to fight these colonists and bring them back into the fold instead of taking any peaceful recons, recon, whatever the word is, any peaceful means of reconciling with the colonists. And so the American colonists are very much blaming the king, and it really is the king's fault. Like, King George III is a terrible king. He just makes everything worse. Him and his best friend, Lord North, who will become prime minister, just ruin this entire uh, chapter and ruin the British Empire, at least when it comes to having a huge portion of their colonies just rebel and secede from the British Empire. Speaking of prime ministers, Grenville is no longer the prime minister. He is replaced by Rockingham. And so the Marquis of Rockingham sought to calm colonial unrest by repealing the unpopular Stamp Act while simultaneously passing the Declaratory Act, which we have on the timeline, to reaffirm Parliament's authority over the colonies. Unlike Grenville, who had pushed direct taxation to raise revenue, Rockingham favored conciliation and compromise, hoping to preserve imperial unity through moderation rather than strict enforcement, leaving the colonies temporarily relieved but wary of Britain's continued claim to absolute power. And so, like I said before, because of switching over the leadership, you're going to have different policies. That's why keeping track of who is prime minister is very important. And so you have Grenville, he's going to propose direct taxes and regulations on the colonies and abolishing colonial currencies. And now you have Grenville, or now you have Rockingham. He's going to be pulling a lot of those restrictions back, repealing them. He's going to repeal the Stamp Act before it even goes into effect, and he's going to repeal the Sugar Act, and he's going to pass a few acts to open trade. And but he does pass one act, the Declaratory Act, which will be even worse than all the acts passed under Grenville, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes when I reach the act itself on the timeline. And so now you still have the stamp crisis going on, and you have the first organized protest. This is called the Loyal Nine, where key middle-class merchants in Boston who organized to hang an effigy of their stamp distributor, merchant Andrew Oliver, who was Thomas Hutchinson's brother-in-law. Thomas Hutchinson is a loyalist, and he is, at this time, the governor of Massachusetts, so this is a pretty bold statement on behalf of the merchants of Boston. And so, as part of a massive public demonstrations against the Stamp Act, the effigy was hanged on an elm tree, which became known as the Liberty Tree. In the evening, demonstrators burned the effigy and destroyed a building near the dock, which was rumored to soon be used for stamp distribution. Then they went to Oliver's home, which they vandalized. Oliver resigns the post the next day. So this is an act of terrorism, burning an effigy, and then vandalizing property and forcing what would be a tax collector to resign. And so this is the first of many such protests that will happen, especially in Massachusetts. Massachusetts men, especially in Boston, are very violent. And the whole effigy thing is a very fascinating history in Boston when it comes to the effigy. So Boston is, Massachusetts, founded by very strict Puritans, very strict. And they absolutely loathe the Pope. And so the tradition of burning an effigy actually begins as burning the effigy of the Pope every single year. So again, it's part of this weird transition, or at least an interesting transition, from a religious aspect to a more political aspect. You had Puritan and other non-Church of England religious leaders during the Great Awakening, which is the Calvinist revival in the Americas, right around the time of the French and Indian War, circa 1740s and 1750s, so right before this time. You had these religious leaders who weren't part of the Church of England are going to be complaining about the Church of England and the expansion of that church's authority in the colonies. They're going to be complaining through the medium of newspapers, of writing political essays. Well, that practice of religious figures complaining with political essays in newspapers will transition to political leaders as opposed to religious leaders, lawyers, and politicians. They're going to use the same medium to complain about British policy in political essays that they write and then publish in newspapers. Now you have yet another religious tradition, which is burning the Pope in effigy. That religious tradition gets transitioned into a new political tradition, where instead of burning the Pope, you're now burning tax collectors. And pretty soon, you're going to be burning the king in effigy. So that's just a very interesting aspect of this time period, this relationship between the religious traditions evolving into political traditions. And here's a primary source of the Local 9 protest. This primary source is a letter written by John Adams talking about the events. Or not a letter, this is his journal, his diary. And then pretty soon after, in August of 1765, the mob, pretty much the same mob as the protesters of the Local 9, will sack Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's mansion in Massachusetts. So the governor, or at least the lieutenant governor, is Hutchinson, and his house, his mansion, will be attacked and vandalized by protesters. Now we have the objections to the taxation of our American colonies by the legislature of Great Britain by Soame Jenyns. This is a pamphlet written by Soame Jenyns to defend Parliament's authority to tax the American colonies and rejected colonial claims that taxation required direct representation, but instead virtual representation. So you're going to see the term virtual representation being used by loyalists and members of Parliament who don't want the colonies to be represented in Parliament. They're going to say, oh, well, Parliament is already interested, already has the interest of, securing the rights of the British colonies, and so the British colonies are already represented by the members of Parliament. The American colonists, at least the patriots, the people who are in favor of American representation in Parliament, they are going to argue that virtual representation is no representation at all, and the only proper way to be represented is to have representatives that are of the people, by the people, for the people. I'm sure you heard that before. Hopefully you heard that before. But the idea that a representative must be of the people, meaning someone who is actually from the people themselves, a person who is from a certain political community, like the colonies, who is of the people, by the people, means elected and chosen by the people, and then for the people means that these representatives, who are of and by the people, will fight for the interests of the people. And so there were no members of Parliament at this time who were of the people, by the people, for the people of the American colonies. And so the idea of proper representation or direct representation is a representative who is of the people, by the people, for the people, as opposed to virtual representation, which is, Parliament can claim to care about the colonists, therefore the colonists are represented by that member of Parliament, even though the colonists didn't elect that member of Parliament, nor does the member of Parliament come from the colonies, nor does he even really care about the colonies all that much. Here's Pennsylvania's resolves on the Stamp Act, and this is going to be passed just before the Stamp Act Congress. And so a lot of the colonies that are going to be present at the Stamp Act Congress are preparing their own petitions, which they will then share with each other when creating the United Petition, which is the Stamp Act Congress Resolves, or petition of the Stamp Act Congress to Parliament. Same thing in Massachusetts. You have the Braintree Instructions, authored by John Adams and Samuel Adams, about what their Boston representatives are going to do at the Stamp Act Congress. You have this political essay published in a newspaper, the Boston Gazette, and it's a public letter to the people of Massachusetts, signed by B.W., and it is addressed to the people of Massachusetts in defense of Parliament authority during the escalating Stamp Act crisis. The author argued that resistance to the Stamp Act threatened lawful government, and that the colonies, as part of the British Empire, were bound by acts of Parliament under the principle of constitutional sovereignty. The letter reflected loyalist sentiment within the colonies and highlighted the ideological divide emerging between supporters of imperial authority and advocates of colonial self-government. So again, we don't just include the essays and political ideas of the patriots of the colonial cause. We also include the primary source documents and the opinions and ideas and arguments of the loyalists and the people who were in favor of maintaining the parliamentary control without any representation by the colonies. And now you have the Stamp Act Congress, which convenes in October of 1765, where delegates from 9 colonies convene in New York City for the Stamp Act Congress to coordinate a unified response to the Stamp Act imposed by Parliament earlier that year. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances asserting that taxation without representation violated the rights of English subjects, and that only colonial assemblies possessed the authority to tax the colonies. This meeting marked the first time marked one of the first major examples of intercolonial cooperation and helped lay the groundwork for later continental congresses during the American Revolution. So the framework of the First and Second Continental Congresses, and really the framework of our current Congress, was started by the Stamp Act Congress. And we actually have the Stamp Act Congress resolves, and I made a video of myself reading these resolves, so you can watch that, or you can read the resolves yourself. Massachusetts will reply to Governor Bernard, and this is a formal reply by the General Assembly, defending its opposition to the Stamp Act and asserting the constitutional rights of the colony. The House argued that taxation without representation violated the rights of English subjects and maintained that colonial assemblies retained authority over internal taxation. The response deepened the conflict between royal governors and colonial legislatures. Keep in mind, in the Declaration of Independence, they're not just blaming the king, they're also blaming the royal governors. At least they mention the royal governors a few times. Massachusetts will pass its own resolves about the Stamp Act. George Mercer, confronted by an angry mob, Virginia's lieutenant governor rescues the colony's stamp distributor, George Mercer, from an angry crowd in front of a coffee house. So all the protests and violence against tax collectors is not just local to Boston or the colony of Massachusetts. It is widespread among the colonies. And this guy would resign pretty much the next day. While you have the petitions being sent by the colonial legislature, you will have these boycotts. And so this is one of the first boycotts of British goods, which they call it a non-importation agreement. That's just a boycott. And this is done by New York merchants. And they will last about a year before having to be renewed. And they're going to publish the list of those merchants who didn't boycott. And so a lot of those merchants are going to be attacked by mobs. So it's not just the tax collectors or the stamp distributors who are going to be attacked by mobs, it's also colonial merchants who are not going to participate in the boycotts. They're also going to be attacked by mobs. So they're basically doxxed by their fellow colonists in order for them to get attacked. You have South Carolina resolves against the Stamp Act. Connecticut will send its own resolves. And here's a very interesting read. Considerations of Imposing Taxes by Daniel Delaney. And he writes this long essay, beautifully written essay, on why taxation must be done through representatives with consent of those taxed. So if you want a more complete argument, legal argument, and moral argument too, as to why representation was so important when it comes to taxation, then I would highly suggest you read this document by Daniel Delaney. Like I said before, in Parliament is not 100% on board with the Stamp Act. And so here's a primary source by William Pitt. He gives a speech against the Stamp Act in favor of repealing the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act hasn't even gone into effect yet. And now you have all these protests, and even Parliament is debating whether or not they should repeal the Stamp Act. And so during the debates in Parliament, William Pitt, this is William Pitt the Elder, will give this speech. And I made a video of me reading that speech that you can listen to on our YouTube channel. Ben Franklin, he is in England at this time. He's living in London, and he is going to represent the colony of Pennsylvania. And so he testifies before the committee of the House of Commons on the unpopularity of the Stamp Act in the colonies and claims it is unenforceable. He argues that an internal tax, it is that as a internal tax, it is unconstitutional, whereas external taxes, like the duties, such as trade regulations, do not require the consent of the colonial assemblies. Here's an infamous event. This is one of the first instances of tarring and feathering of a tax collector. And so, well, there's actually a Captain William Smith, a sea captain in Norfolk, suspected of informing customs officials about colonial smuggling, was seized by an angry crowd during the Stamp Act crisis and became the earliest well-known victim of tarring and feathering. The mob covered him with tar and feathers, paraded him publicly, and reportedly threw him into the harbor before he was rescued, establishing a form of political intimidation, domestic terrorism, that would become increasingly common during the imperial crisis. He will be one of around 70 reported cases of tarring and feathering in the next decade. So, first well-known case, and he is the first of 70 recorded cases of tarring and feathering. Northampton, Virginia, County Court declares the Stamp Act unconstitutional. So you have a lot of local effort in order to push back against Parliament. Many times when I hear people, especially like YouTube historians, talk about the American Revolution, especially from a class standpoint, they will usually argue that the American Revolution was the rich convincing the poor to fight the British Empire. That's simply not the case. Many of these efforts against the British Empire, many of these movements, many of these actions are done by the poor, by the average colonist, and by the middle class, if you will, not by the super elite who will be loyal to Parliament. At least most of them will be loyalists. So, the American Revolution was not really the rich and powerful fighting for their own private interest, convincing the poor to fight for them. It's a lot more complicated than a simple class exploitation thing. So I'll be more than happy to debate anyone who who try to make that argument. But at least for here, Northampton County Court proceeds to do business without stamped paper, declaring the Stamp Act unconstitutional and therefore not binding on Virginians. Leadtown resolves to protest the Stamp Act. Again, you have local engagement, local protest, local demonstrations of not enforcing the law, which will, contribute to the American Revolution and the War for Independence. So again, it's not a top-down approach. It's a mix. You do have some elites, the wealthy of colonial society, who are against British authority, but you also have many, many local leaders and people of the communities, the common folk, who will participate in these demonstrations. Here's another essay written by Richard Bland. An inquiry into the rights of the British colonies argues that Parliament not only lacks the authority to tax the colonies, it also does not have the power to legislate for them in any way, because Americans are a distinct people from the inhabitants of Britain. So this is a break in what many colonists, even patriots, will argue. So most patriots at this time are arguing that they are still British subjects that deserve the same rights as their fellow Englishmen in England. Now, we're starting to see some people, like this, Richard Bland, argue that Americans are a distinct group of people. This is not common, at least not yet, for people to consider Americans to be distinct. This is not an argument that the American colonists want to make, because the main argument that they're making is that they're English subjects, they're English citizens who deserve the same English rights. So if they were to call themselves distinct, then they wouldn't be deserving of the same English rights. Well, now you have Richard Bland, and soon others, who argue that because they are separate people, they deserve to have separate representation and separate rights, and Parliament does not have complete control over this separate group of people. Now, Parliament will repeal the Stamp Act on March 18th, 1766. On the same day that the repeal of the Stamp Act happened, you have the Declaratory Act. And so, same day, and this is going to be the most insightful, it is the most incendiary policy that Britain will pass. And it is a very short act. All that it's doing is saying that Parliament had full authority to make any law to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In all cases whatsoever, to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever, is going to be repeated in so many petitions. And when you read the Declaration of Independence, when you read in the beginning, it talks about Parliament and the King trying, or most of the King, trying to establish an absolute tyranny. This is what they're talking about in the Declaration of Independence. Because Parliament, and nominally the King, is arguing that they can bind the colonies to pass laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That is absolute tyranny. So the Declaration of Independence is referring to this act. And it's not just the Declaration of Independence, it's going to be other petitions, like petitions passed by the First Continental Congress, and some petitions passed by the states or colonies and by the Second Continental Congress, not including or including the Declaration of Independence. So this is a very important act. This is probably the most important act that Parliament passes, which absolutely angers the American colonists. And it happens on the same day as the repeal of the Stamp Act. Both of these acts are passed on the same day. It takes a little while, but news of the repeal of the Stamp Act will reach the colonies on May 16th, 1766. And we actually have a newspaper of the news reaching the colonies. And so news of the repeal of the Stamp Act reached the American colonies, spreading quickly through ports and colonial capitals as merchants, newspapers, and officials confirmed the decision of Parliament. The announcement was met with widespread public celebration, including bonfires, public gatherings, and expressions of loyalty to the crown, reflecting relief at the end of the immediate crisis, the stamp crisis. However, the accompanying Declaratory Act, which affirmed Parliament's authority over the colonies, ensured that underlying constitutional tensions remained unresolved and would soon reemerge in new forms of the imperial conflict. So, Declaratory Act, very important. And the phrase, binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever, is exactly why I chose the name of this section. Binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So, binding the colonies. And this is a play on, because not only is it directly referencing this act, the Declaratory Act, but it's also talking about how the colonies themselves were binding together in the Stamp Act Congress. So Parliament and its decisions, its policies of binding the colonies under the authority of Parliament were also binding the colonies to each other to fight Parliament. So binding the colonies as a name for the section is a play on what Parliament believes that they have the power to do, but also with what the colonies are doing, which is binding together. So I thought choosing that name was smart. And in response to the news of the repeal of the Stamp Act, Mayhew, this is Jonathan Mayhew, the same guy who wrote all those religious essays and sermons, will write this sermon called "The Snare Broken," and I love that name. That's so cool. That title, "The Snare," the trap is broken, and so he's just celebrating the passage, the repeal of the Stamp Act. Also, a policy of Rockingham is the Free Port Act, which opened up trade. So this is undermine the Currency Act, or the Sugar Act. And in fact, the Sugar Act itself will be repealed, let's see, on the same day. So the Sugar Act, which started this section, at least was the first British policy that this section includes, is repealed by the end of it. And it's repealed right around the same time as the repeal of the Stamp Act, but also the passage of the Declaratory Act. And then the Freeport Act just opened up trade with some of the Caribbean colonies and the North American colonies. Virginians will hold a celebration with a ball and general illumination in Williamsburg, Virginia. And then you have the Treaty of Oswego, which officially ended Pontiac's rebellion. So everything that began at the start of this section, which is Pontiac's rebellion, but also the Sugar Act and the Currency Act, these are now resolved at the end of this section. And it's resolved at the end of Rockingham's prime ministership. And so you have in this section from 1763 to 1766, it's not a long time period, but so much stuff has happened. I mean, I've been talking for over an hour and 30 minutes, and I've only just summarized the first 3 years of this chapter. So we have 2 more sections, and more stuff happens. So this is going to be a very long live stream, at least compared to the other chapters that I've done in the past couple of days, in the past couple of live streams. So, but we finally got through this section, the first section. And it ends with the Treaty of Oswego and the end of the prime ministership of Rockingham. So you have Grenville and Rockingham, you have Pontiac's Rebellion, you have Sugar and Currency Acts, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, the repeal of those acts, the dissolution of the Virginia colony, at least the attempted dissolution of the Virginia colony for refusing to enforce the Quartering Act, and you have the Declaratory Act, all these petitions, the Stamp Act Congress, all this stuff, the early petition, or the early protests, tarring and feathering, boycotts, all this stuff begins in just these 3 years and happened in these 3 years. It's a lot going on. Now let's go to the next section, which is called The Rights of Englishmen, from 1766 to 1773. And so we begin with the start of Pitt the Elder. He becomes prime minister. This is the same William Pitt the Elder who argued in Parliament against the Stamp Act and for the repeal of the Stamp Act, but also for the passage of the Declaratory Act. So he is on the side of colonial representation in Parliament, but he is also on the side of Parliament's authority over the colonies. So he's not 100% for the colonial cause. In fact, most Whigs are not 100% on board of the colonial cause. Even though they want representation, they also want Parliament to have authority over the colonies. And let me just read the description that I have for him. William Pitt initially reassured the American colonies by opposing direct taxation like the Stamp Act, as I just mentioned, instead emphasizing Britain's right to regulate trade rather than extract revenue. However, illness left his government fractured, following Charles Townshend to introduce the Townshend Acts, marking a sharp turn back toward revenue extraction via taxation and strict enforcement of trade regulations by sending regiments of soldiers to cities like Boston. Unlike Grenville's strict financial or fiscal discipline or Rockingham's conciliatory repeal, Pitt's vision of imperial unity collapsed in practice, deepening colonial distrust of British governance. And so William Pitt, he's an old and sickly man, and so he allows Townshend, Charles Townshend, to introduce the new revenue program to raise money, which would become known as the Townshend Acts. And there's 5 of them. The first one is called the New York Restraining Act, and so this is to basically suspend the legislative functions of New York for not complying with the Quartering Act that was passed in 1765 over here. And so New York they will, funnily enough, enforce the Quartering Act, but only after this act is passed. Then you have the official Revenue Act of 1767, which is the second Townshend Act. This Revenue Act imposed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the American colonies as part of Charles Townsend's plan to raise imperial revenue in America. Parliament argued that these customs duties were external taxes connected to trade regulation, while colonial critics maintained that any tax imposed primarily to raise revenue without colonial consent violated their constitutional rights. The act revived the taxation controversy of the Townshend Act and the Currency Act that followed the repeal of the Stamp Act, and became a central source of colonial resistance in the years leading to the Revolution. Then you have the Third Townshend Act, which is the Commissioners of Customs Act. This is to strengthen the enforcement of the Second Townshend Act. Then you have the Indemnity Act of 1767. This is the Fourth Townshend Act, which removed or reduced import duties on tea brought into Britain by British East India Company and then re-exported to the American colonies. The measure was intended to lower the price of legally imported British tea and increase customs revenue by encouraging colonists to purchase taxed tea rather than smuggled Dutch imports. Although less controversial than the other Townshend Acts, it formed part of a broader strategy to make parliamentary taxation in the colonies more effective and economically sustainable. These first four Townshend Acts will be passed on July 2nd, 1767, by receiving royal assent. So every single bill that passes through Parliament has to be signed into law by the king. That's what the royal assent is. Pretty similar for our system, which I kind of don't like, where Congress has to get its acts signed by the president before the bill, I should say, becomes an act. I kind of disagree with this. I think I think that Congress should be able to pass acts, not just bills, but acts, without needing the approval of the president. Now, I still believe in the veto power of the president as an active check against Congress, but I don't think that Congress should be required to have the president sign a bill into law. So there's a difference between signing a bill into law and vetoing a bill. I support the veto power. I don't support the signing a bill into law responsibility of the president. But that's a different discussion. We don't have to go into that. And so just like with the stamp crisis, where you have people protesting, mostly New York merchants, now you have Boston. They pass a document, a non-importation agreement, where the merchants of Boston will boycott British goods. Then you have a very famous series of letters written by John Dickinson called Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. And these letters will popularize the use of newspapers and political essays in order to express ideas and also criticize the government under a pseudonym. And so John Dickinson, he becomes very popular because of these essays. And he wrote a bunch of these essays that I have compiled and added to this timeline. And again, if you're looking at these primary source documents, if you want to read the full text of these documents, you can click on the Read Document button, and it'll take you to the full text of these documents. So I have a bunch of these. There's like 13 or 14, I think. 11, let's see. You have Massachusetts Circular Letter. The Massachusetts House of Representatives issued the Massachusetts Circular Letter, drafted primarily by Samuel Adams. The letter was sent to other colonial assemblies, urging unified opposition to the Townshend Acts and arguing that taxation without representation violated the rights of English subjects. It called for intercolonial cooperation and asserted that only colonial legislatures could lawfully tax the inhabitants of their respective colonies. The circular letter escalated tensions with Britain and prompted royal governors to pressure assemblies to rescind the letters, making it a key moment in the growth of coordinated colonial resistance. Remember Massachusetts? I think it was Massachusetts. Let's see. Yeah, Massachusetts Circular Letter of 1765 called for the Stamp Act Congress, and now you have a very similar event where the same colony, Massachusetts, is calling for a renewed Congress, this time to protest the Townshend Acts. And so Governor Francis Bernard governor of Massachusetts, he replaced, he was the governor while Thomas Hutchinson was there. Thomas Hutchinson was lieutenant governor. I misspoke back then. And so Governor Francis Bernard, he dissolves the Massachusetts General Court, which is the General Assembly, in response to Massachusetts' circular letter. But not before, or I guess it was before, but not, it didn't end the circulation of the circular letter. And so Virginia will accept the circular letter, and Virginia will send its own petition. It's petition, memorial, and remonstrance. Remonstrance just means protest. And so this, let's see, former protest against the Townshend Acts and Parliament's claim to tax the colonies for revenue. And so this is from the perspective of Virginians. Then you have New Jersey accepts the Massachusetts circular letter. Connecticut accepts it. And then you have the Liberty Riot. So John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, is confiscated by the Board of Customs Commissioners created by the Townshend Acts under suspicion of smuggling. Several thousand Bostonians attack the homes of the customs commissioners, attack the customs inspector, and burn a boat belonging to one of the customs collectors on the Boston Common in front of Hancock's house. And so this is yet another instance of burning things by the colonists, especially when it comes to the commissioners who are supposed to enforce these acts from Parliament. Massachusetts votes not to rescind the circular letter. So remember Francis Bernard, the royal governor of Massachusetts, he orders Massachusetts to rescind the letter. Massachusetts refuses to rescind the letter by a vote of 92 to 17. And so 92 will be a common number that is spread around to like the protest of 92 or the defiance of 92. So you have the fifth Townshend Act, which was passed over a year after the other four. And so this is the Vice Admiralty Court Act, which expanded the jurisdictions of royal maritime courts in the American colonies, strengthening enforcement of customs and trade regulations. Under the Townshend revenue system, the act allowed cases involving smuggling and customs violations to be tried in Vice Admiralty courts without juries, often presided by Crown-appointed judges. Colonists criticized the measure as a denial of the traditional right to trial by jury and saw it as part of a broader effort by Parliament to enforce revenue laws through centralized and authoritarian legal mechanisms. So, Parliament is becoming a little too aggressive, and now they're violating even more rights of the Englishmen. Boston will pass another non-importation agreement. Most of these boycotts are 1 year long, so every year they have to renew them. Boston Town Meeting resolutions. Again, a lot of this stuff is local level. So the idea that it's top down is just simply not true. It's very much bottom up, maybe middle up, if you want to say the middle class. And so for this document, a town meeting in Boston adopted resolutions protesting the arrival of British troops sent to enforce excuse me, sent to enforce um let's see, customs regulations under the Townsend Acts. The meeting argued that the stationing of regular troops in a major colonial port during peacetime was an unconstitutional measure that threatened civil liberties and local self-government. The resolutions reflected rising tensions between colonial authorities and imperial administrators, and they foreshadowed the escalating conflict that would soon culminate in events such as the Boston Massacre. Ooh. So we're starting to get close to that. And we have the Boston Army and Fleet arriving in, or the British Army and Fleet arriving in Boston. And here is a depiction of that event. And this is made by Paul Revere. I think it was Paul Revere. Yeah, I think so. And so he makes this engraving. He also makes the engraving that's the background, which is the Boston Massacre. And so this engraving is a depiction of this event, which happened on September 30, 1768. And then, so William Pitt, he resigns because he's sick, and Lord Grafton will become prime minister. Grafton oversaw escalating unrest in North America as he upheld the Townsend duties and sent regiments of soldiers to cities like Boston, while simultaneously attempting partial concessions. Unlike Grenville's rigid taxation schemes, Rockingham's conciliatory repeal, or Pitt's lofty but ineffective imperial vision, Grafton's inconsistent approach, wavering between military coercion and compromise, bred mistrust, deepening the rift between Britain and the colonies. So again, keeping track of who is prime minister is very important, because each prime minister has their own take on what policies to pass, how to enforce those policies, what policies to repeal, how to appeal and reconcile the differences with the colonists. And these differences in their platforms will lead to this back and forth and this cyclical nature of this time period of the imperial crisis. And so having inconsistent leadership is not really good when it comes to a very sensitive issue like this imperial crisis. Parliament will debate the issues going on in America. Lord North, a member of Parliament at this time, argues against a general inquiry into the American colonies, hoping to confine parliamentary concerns to matters in Boston. So Lord North just wants to focus on what's happening in Boston. He says that a general inquiry would not be a measure of conciliation, it would be the means of fresh disputes. William Beckford argues for a general inquiry, telling North that you know very little of the state of America, but from one side. Barlow Trechkothick, these are interesting names, supports Beckford, stating that I look upon America as deluded. And so Britain, Parliament, is debating these issues, and I hope to add even more primary sources about all these debates, if we can find the full text of these debates happening in Parliament. The Junius letters begin to be published, most effective, sustained political criticisms of the governments of the Duke of Grafton and then Lord North begin to appear in the Public Advisor, a London newspaper, in the form of a series of letters pseudonymously written by Junius, whose true identity remains unknown. They run monthly, sometimes more frequently, until January 21st, 1772, and are remarkable for their political insight and literary quality. They are reprinted in newspapers throughout the British world and become the most famous polemic of the day, mostly in England. House of Commons considers Massachusetts circular letter and 1768 Virginia resolutions. Edmund Burke, George Grenville, Lord North, and Isaac Barr are among those who debate what to do about American affairs in light of measures from Massachusetts and Virginia. Burke responds to claim that the problem with Massachusetts lies in the colony having too much democracy, and pointing out, erroneously, that Virginia has no democracy in its government. Grenville argues that those who have deluded the Americans are in this country, while Barr suggests that it is not a question of one refractory colony. The whole colony is ripe with revolt. The whole colony being the whole, region of colonies, the North American colonies. Resolution of Parliament to revive the policy of transporting criminals from North America to England to stand trial. So this is debated throughout January of 1769, and the measure is intended to send a message to colonials that dissidents cannot hide behind like-minded neighbors who choose to ignore the law. George Grenville, the former prime minister, says the move is insulting our understandings, because in truth you do not mean to send for anybody, and this resolution is so much waste paper. Virginia resolves on the Townshend Acts. So this is Virginia's petition against the Townshend Acts. And again, this is reaffirming the idea of representation and constitutional rights of English subjects. The resolves condemned Parliament's revenue measures and reiterated that only colonial assemblies possessed the authority to tax their own inhabitants. They also encouraged intercolonial cooperation and helped sustain organized resistance as tensions between Britain and the colonies continued to intensify. Now, royal governors don't really like these resolves, and so the royal governor of Virginia, Governor Norborne Berkeley, dissolves the Virginia Assembly. And so he dissolves the Virginia Assembly right after the Virginia Resolves are passed, because of the Virginia Resolves are passed. And this dissolution was intended to suppress coordinated resistance and reassert royal authority over colonial governance. However, it instead prompted Virginia legislatures to meet independently and adopt further non-importation agreements, reinforcing intercolonial unity and deepening the constitutional crisis. And so, right after the Virginia royal governor dissolving the Virginia Assembly, the House of Burgesses, Virginia passes a non-importation agreement, which again is a boycott. And this time, it's not just boycott of merchants, it's now boycott of members of the former Burgesses. So that's a huge step. Charleston, South Carolina, will also pass boycotts and non-importation agreements. And Governor Tryon, he's the governor of North Carolina, gives a speech, and he will dissolve the North Carolina Assembly. After disputes over colonial resistance to the Townshend Acts and support for non-importation agreements. In his address, Tryon condemned colonial attempts to coordinate economic boycotts and asserted the authority of royal governance over legislative defiance. The dissolution deepened political tensions in North Carolina and reflected the broader pattern of escalating conflict between colonial assemblies and royal governors across British America. And so, how this time period is taught, it's mostly Massachusetts, and then later the other colonies join. No, it's pretty much all the colonies, and from the very beginning, New York is protesting and disobeying orders like the Quartering Act of 1765. You have Virginia, they're protesting the Townshend Acts, and their House of Burgesses gets dissolved. Now it's North Carolina, and it's also Massachusetts. So it's not just one colony starting it, and then all the other colonies join, which that is kind of how this time period is taught, and it's common in media like HBO's John Adams, where at the start of the series, the other colonies are saying, "Oh, Massachusetts is starting the rebellion." No, all the colonies, pretty much, except for maybe Rhode Island, um, is starting this rebellion. It's not just one colony that drags the other colonies. It's pretty much all the colonies. And in protest in Williamsburg, Virginia, 100 people will attend a ball, and they will appear in homespun gowns to show support for the boycott and protest of the Townsend Acts. So they're going to make their own clothes instead of buying clothes from Britain. And so Grafton, he is no longer prime minister at the start of 1770, and he is replaced by Lord North. Lord North will stay prime minister for the next 13 years, one of the longest reigning prime ministers in English history. 13 years as prime minister, which is insane. So for the rest of this chapter, the prime minister is Lord North, and for the entirety of the War for Independence, he's going to be the Prime Minister of England, which is pretty much the entirety of the next chapter, until the surrender at Yorktown. When news of that reaches Lord North in England, he will resign because of that. So that happens in 1781. News. So about 11 years, not 13 years, 11 years as prime minister, which is still an incredibly long time, especially since the other 4 prime ministers in this chapter were only prime minister for like a year or two. So very, very impressive. And also, he's a conservative. The other 4 prime ministers in this chapter before Lord North are Whigs, which are much more progressive. And so him being a conservative, him being a friend of King George III, and him being very authoritative and militaristic will have a major impact on the relations with the colonies. Because as soon as he becomes prime minister, we have the Boston Massacre, which happens just a month later. And before the Boston Massacre, which people say the people who died at the Boston Massacre were the first people to die in this crisis, this rebellion against England, that's not true. The first person to die is as a kid named Christopher Cider. He's shot and dies at a protest. And so he was part of a crowd in a protesting outside the home of loyalist merchant Theophilus Lilly, who had refused to sign the non-importation agreements of Massachusetts, of Boston. A customs officer, Ebenezer Richardson, tried to disperse the crowd. He was pelted with stones and debris and fired his musket from inside his house, fatally wounding Cedar. And so Cedar dies, and there is a massive, and I mean massive, funeral procession, which became a political demonstration, where around 13,000 or around 3,000 people in a town of 15,000 people marched in the procession, led by Samuel Adams and other Patriot leaders. The funeral was deliberately framed as a martyr's burial, the first blood of the struggle with Britain. And so this is the first death in the struggle between the colonists. This is the first colonial death in the struggle between the colonists and Britain and Britain's policies. Following the funeral procession, there is this brawl that happens in Boston between workers and off-duty British soldiers who were stationed in Boston to protect the commission's officers. And following this brawl, so that brawl was March 2nd, and then on March 5th, 1770, you have the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers stationed in Boston fired into a crowd, killing 5 civilians, whether the shooting was done in self-defense or as an act of tyranny against the colonists. Excuse me, will be determined by a trial. And so this is an engraving by Paul Revere, and you'll see that up here on the second floor of the Butcher's Hall, you see this gun sticking out and shooting. Well, this is not a reference to the Boston Massacre. This little detail is actually a reference to Christopher Cedar, because Ebenezer Richardson was on the second floor and he shot out the window, and he shot into a crowd of people and killed the kid, Christopher Cedar. And so, this is a little detail added by Paul Revere. So it's not just the Boston Massacre being depicted, it's also the killing of Christopher Cedar in this one image. And the great irony is within a month, so this is probably around the time where Parliament gets the news of the Boston Massacre, that Parliament will repeal most of the Townshend duties. So the whole reason why the Boston Massacre happened, which is over the issue of the Townshend duties, gets resolved. So it's bad timing. But at the same time, you have the release of John Wilkes. Remember from the previous section, John Wilkes will be one of the very early person, he's a member of Parliament, who gets arrested for libel. So it's a freedom of speech issue. And he gets released in 1770 after serving a sentence for seditious libel. Ebenezer Richardson, he is found guilty of murdering Christopher Cedar. However, he will be pardoned, and this will anger the colonists. Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament, will write this political essay, Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, that is, the protests and issues going on in the colonies. And he argues that Britain's political crisis stemmed from the rise of a corrupt court system that allowed ministers to wield power without accountability, undermining constitutional balance. He uses the growing unrest in the American colonies, especially resistance to the Townshend duties, as evidence that the same secretive factional governance that distorted British politics at home was also provoking imperial discord abroad. Burke concludes that only by restoring genuine parliamentary independence and curbing ministerial manipulation can Britain heal its domestic divisions and preserve the loyalty of its colonies. So he's saying that corruption in the enforcement of the policies is what's leading to the discontent in the colonies, as opposed to the actual policies themselves. So I think Burke is kind of wrong. I mean, he's right that there is a lot of corruption, but he's also wrong that it's just the corruption that is the problem. It's fundamentally these policies being passed by Parliament, and more fundamentally, the lack of representation for the colonies in Parliament. Again, the non-importation agreements are for a year, and has to be renewed, and so this is just the renewal of the Non-Importation Association of Virginia. Virginia will send a petition to the king to procure a repeal of those disagreeable acts of Parliament in the form of taxes that the national legislature has imposed on the American colonies, that is Parliament. And so now the colonies are trying to circumvent Parliament and appeal directly to the king. The colonies would do something similar at the end of this chapter with the olive branch petition, which was meant for the king to see, not for Parliament to see. During this time, you have the start of the regulators, and they will riot in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and they will attack several members of the local elite, including a sheriff and several justices of the peace, along with sacking a prominent elite's home. This will lead into one of the first battles of the American Revolution, which is not the Battle of Concord or the Battle of Boston, but instead the Battle of Alamance, which happened years before the Battle of Concord. The Mid-Atlantic Quakers admonish friends who sign associations. That's the non-importation associations. So during the yearly meeting of Quakers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, friends are admonished against entering into associations and measures proposed by some inhabitants of these colonies for the asserting and maintaining their evil rights and liberties, which are frequently productive of consequences inconsistent with the nature of the gospel and our peaceable testimony here thereto. And so the Quaker community is now going to be split. You have the Quakers who will, many Quakers, like this group, will be arguing that people, their fellow Quakers, should follow the law and obey the law, regardless of what they think of the law. And so the Quaker attitude will become an insult used by patriots, saying, "Oh, well, you're being too Quaker." So Quaker will become an insult for many of the patriots, since many Quakers are loyalists. And then you have Captain Preston's trial. Captain Preston was the leader of the soldiers during the Boston Massacre, and so the trial will last about a week, and the defense was led by John Adams. The prosecution argued that while Preston had not fired a single shot himself, he had given the order to fire. Preston would have to take responsibility for the 5 civilian deaths. The defense, led by John Adams, argued that there was not sufficient evidence to prove that Preston had given the fatal order, and that it was in self-defense. Even if he did give the order, it would be in self-defense, because the crowd was harassing the soldiers. The constitutional controversy between Antillon and First Citizen ignites in Maryland. The Maryland's governor's proclamation setting the scale of fees in the colony erupts in a epistolary, which means letters, open letters, debate between Daniel Delaney Jr., who writes as Antillon, and Charles Carroll, the First Citizen, that reveals the growing constitutional tensions between parliamentary sovereignty and colonial legislative independence. So you have these, political debates going on in the form of essays being published in newspapers, which is always fun to read. And I encourage you guys to read it. Read all these primary source documents. And so the Boston Massacre troops for the trial for the troops. The 6 soldiers were acquitted and 2 were branded for manslaughter. And then you have the Privy Council in England disallows the Virginia Act to tax the slave trade. And so Virginia is very interesting. You have a bunch of people, most of them in Virginia, especially the House of Burgesses, are slave owners. However, at the same time, they're trying to restrict the slave trade. It's weird. I have to do more research. Why would the slave-dependent colony restrict the slave trade by increasing taxes on slave imports to a to a level where it would make the slave trade unprofitable, which would, it's argued by the Privy Council, and is intended to operate as an entire prohibition on the importation of slaves into Virginia. The Privy Council holds that the Virginia Assembly does not have the authority to pass any law that directly applies to anyone outside of Virginians, such as the merchants of Bristol and Liverpool. And so this is an example of what would be mentioned in the draft of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian, of the king and Parliament forcing Virginia as a colony and forcing the other colonies to accept the slave trade. And so a lot of people on YouTube, or a lot of historians and educators, when they read that part of the Declaration of Independence, the draft, where it talks about the king forcing slavery upon the colonies, for some reason they don't do further research to answer that question. They say that Thomas Jefferson was just making it up, that this is a fiction of Thomas Jefferson, that the king and Parliament, most of the king, were not enforcing or not, forcing slavery upon the colonies. However, they were. And this is an example of that, where Virginia, a colony, was trying to really prohibit the importation of slaves, and Virginia and Parliament and the king, since Parliament and king are connected, will disallow Virginia to enforce this act, which means Parliament is forcing Virginia to accept the slave trade. And this also goes against the narrative that the American Revolution was fought to maintain slavery. There are more examples of the colonies trying to end slavery, or at least heavily restrict the slave trade, than there are examples of the colonies being concerned about the slave trade. I'm trying to defend the slave trade. So it is a very interesting, a very controversial dynamic during this time period. It's very interesting, and I would love to speak on this more in more detail in some other time. So Ebenezer Richardson, in May of 1771, the guy who killed Christopher Reed, or Christopher Cider, he will receive a royal pardon after being convicted and sentenced to death. Governor Tryon of North Carolina, he will lead a colonial militia force into the interior of North Carolina, entering the region around Hillsborough to suppress the growing regulator movement. The regulators had protested colonial corruption, excessive fees, and local governmental abuses, escalating into armed resistance against provincial authorities. Tryon's march culminated in a decisive confrontation at the Battle of Alamance, which is the first battle of the war, of this imperial crisis, although not a single British soldier was killed. Instead, several colonists were killed. When it comes to the environment, the Great Fresh hits the Virginia Tidewater. A torrential rainstorm in the Blue Ridge Mountains results in unprecedented flooding that wipes out crops, buildings, and kills approximately 150 people from the Piedmont through the Tidewater. On May 27th, a ship's captain near Richmond records the James River as 40 feet higher than normal. The Virginia Assembly meets in July to assess the damage and provide emergency relief to victims. So this isn't really related to much of anything, but it's just interesting getting context of like what else is going on. And so talking about the environment and a major storm like this, and the damages it caused is just a little bit more interesting content to have on these timelines. Now you have Lord Dunmore. He arrives at Williamsburg to start his post as the Virginia governor. John Murray, the fourth Earl of Dunmore, which is Lord Dunmore, arrived in Williamsburg to assume his post as royal governor of the colony. His arrival marked a transition in Virginia's colonial administration during the period of increasing political tension between colonial assemblies and the British imperial policy. Dunmore's governorship would later become significant in the escalating conflicts leading toward the American Revolution, particularly as disputes over authority, taxation, and governance intensified. So Lord Dunmore is going to be a very important person for the American Revolution. Let's see, A Calm and Respectful Thoughts on the Negative of the Crown by Zubley. This is another political essay talking about the negative power of the crown, which is the crown's authority to veto colonial legislation, and its implications for colonial self-government. Zubley argued that while the crown possessed legitimate constitutional authority within the British Empire, its use of the veto in colonial affairs should be exercised cautiously to avoid undermining the traditional rights of representative assemblies. And in June of 1772, you have the burning of the Gaspee, which is burned by Rhode Islanders. So I made a comment earlier that Rhode Islanders were not causing a ruckus in the American colonies. That was a mistake. I shouldn't have said the Rhode Islanders, because they are absolutely causing problems for the British by burning a ship that even the king, George III, will talk about this to Parliament and encourage Parliament to punish those who burn this ship. So it's interesting that the king, gets involved in the imperial crisis because this ship gets burned. The famous Somerset case is decided in London in June of 1772. James Somerset, a runaway slave owned by Charles Stuart, a Scots merchant living in Virginia, is essentially declared a free man by a court led by Lord Mansfield, Chief Justice of the King's Bench, who held that the power claimed by Stuart in trying to capture and return Somerset to slavery never was in use here being England. Although the holding was expressly limited to the facts of the case, it gave rise to the broad belief across the British world that slavery was thereby outlawed in England. Now, this isn't really the case, because the holding was just limited to the case itself, but the idea of slaves and slavery not being allowed in England becomes very popular during this time. And so the credit crisis worsens, a number of growing bankruptcies among them causes an almost general shock of the trading Scots companies in London, and begin to impact English merchant houses. Sorry for the typos. Dozens of merchants fail over the next several months, which puts severe pressure on Chesapeake planters to pay their debts. So there's a credit crisis in London, which will have an impact on the colonists who owe money to the creditors. King George III, proclamation of the Gaspee Affair. I should have written a description for this, but this is in response to the Gaspee burning, which was apparently owned by a friend of the king. Samuel Adams proposes committees of correspondence, and this will be an association and combinations be everywhere set up to consult and recover our just rights. So the committees of correspondence will be the precursor to the First Continental Congress. So Massachusetts would set up a committee of correspondence, which is designed to coordinate communication with the other colonies. And The Rights of the Colonists is a political essay written by Samuel Adams, and he argued that American colonists were entitled to the same natural rights as Englishmen, including self-government and freedom from arbitrary taxation. He emphasized that any attempt by Britain to infringe on these rights threatened liberty and justified colonial resistance. You have this essay, The Beauties of Liberty by John Allen. He celebrated the principles of freedom and self-governance, urging colonists to cherish and defend their liberties against British oppression. The pamphlet combined moral, religious, and political arguments to inspire resistance and support for colonial rights. An address on slavery in America by Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush is going to be a famous patriot. This pamphlet by Benjamin Rush condemned the institution of slavery in the American colonies as morally corrupt and inconsistent with the Christian and Republican principles. Rush argued that slavery degraded both enslaved people and slaveholders, and he urged gradual emancipation along with moral reform. The work became one of the early influential abolitionist texts in British North America and reflected the growing tension between Enlightenment ideals of liberty and the realities of colonial society. So again, the idea that the colonies were founded to preserve slavery is not really founded in many of the colonies. In fact, the exact opposite, where tensions and arguments against slavery are becoming popular, especially in the North, like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Virginia will establish a colonial correspondence in response to Massachusetts establishing a colonial correspondence. And then the last document in this section is Candace by Samuel Adams. And this is another political essay, argued for the protection of colonial liberties and critiqued British attempts to impose laws and taxes without consent. It sought to awaken public awareness of governmental overreach and encourage principled resistance to preserve the rights of the colonies. So this is the last document for that section. Now we go into the third and final section of this chapter, chapter 4. It's called The Cause of America, from 1773 to 1775. And so this section begins with the proposal of the infamous Tea Act. So Lord North, he is the Prime Minister of England at this time, and he introduces the Tea Act to Parliament amid heated debate over how to rescue the financially distressed British East India Company, along with the credit crisis that's going on. Supporters of the bill argued that granting the company direct export privileges and removing certain domestic duties would stabilize its finances and allow it to sell tea more cheaply in the American colonies, thereby discouraging smuggling and restoring legal trade. Critics, however, warned that the measures were politically dangerous because it preserved the Townshend duty on tea, and it would likely provoke colonial resistance by appearing to reaffirm Parliament's contested right to tax America for revenue. And so we have the Tea Act itself, which gets passed on May 10th, 1773. It is designed to rescue the financially struggling British East India Company, as I explained in the previous event on the timeline. John Adams will submit the Hutchinson letters to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Benjamin Franklin sent John Adams certain private and damning letters, notably involving Governor Hutchinson. Hutchinson's now the governor. And Adams then submitted the letters to Massachusetts House of Representatives, who, after reading them the same day, created a committee to consider the letters and write a report, which was submitted later in the month. Oh, I misspelled later. Another typo. And so these are the Massachusetts resolves on the Hutchinson Letters affair. Basically, the Hutchinson letters is Hutchinson sending letters back to England, talking about how much he hates the Massachusetts, his own subjects, and so this will anger Massachusetts a lot. And of course, he will try to deny it. And then an interesting document, poems on various subjects, religious and moral, by Phyllis Wheatley. She is a slave, a woman, and her master decides to publish these poems, and they become very popular in the South. George Washington will comment on how impressed he was of them. To me, it's kind of overrated, but it's interesting history and it gives, I guess, context to the time period. So it doesn't really have much to do with the imperial crisis. And I'll let you guys be the judge of how impressive these poems actually are. And you can read them on our website. You just click on this read document button and it will take you to the full text of the poems. Here's a good Prime Minister's document. Rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one. This is a satirical piece written by Benjamin Franklin, and it's satire because he's giving rules, but all the rules are like terrible rules to follow, and so it's like they're great rules if you want to ruin your own country, your own empire. And so, do these 20 things if you want to destroy your own empire. And he's just listing a bunch of things that the British Empire were doing. So it's very satirical, and he's mocking the British imperial policy towards the American colonies. Philadelphia Resolution, which is very much a Franklin thing to do. Satire is his thing. Philadelphia resolutions on the Tea Act. So Philadelphians draft a set of resolutions to protest the Tea Act as a violent attack upon the liberties of America. And the first tea ships arrive in Boston. After the arrival of the first tea ship, the Dartmouth, on 27th of November, a series of mass meetings in Boston resulted in demands that the duty should not be paid and that the tea be shipped back. Governor Hutchinson ordered such gatherings to disperse, but the people refused. Meanwhile, the Dartmouth entered the customs house and was subject to seizure if the duties were not paid within 20 days. And this leads into the Boston Tea Party, which happens on December 16th, 1773, where people began pouring into Boston, the tea into Boston by the hundreds to attend, or people began pouring, not tea, not yet, into Boston by the hundreds to attend a mass meeting. The co-signees of the tea on the Dartmouth was willing to return the cargo, but Governor Hutchinson refused to permit and ordered warships into the harbor to prevent the ship from sailing. His effort was courageous, but futile. When the mass meeting heard the report, Samuel Adams arose and declared, "This meeting can do no more to save the country." Men dressed as Indians attended the meeting and following it, went to the wharf, boarded a few ships, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor, as reported in Massachusetts Gazette and Boston Weekly Newsletter, December 23rd, 1773. So that's the primary source for this event. New York Association of the Sons of Liberty. So the New York branch of the Sons of Liberty formally organized to coordinate resistance to British tax policy, specifically the tea tax. And then here is probably the most famous event, which is the tarring and feathering of, the most famous tarring event, I should say, which is the tarring and feathering of John Malcolm. John Malcolm a Boston customs official, an outspoken defender of British authority, was attacked in Boston after striking townsman George Hughes with a cane during an altercation that inflamed existing hatred toward Malcolm's enforcement activities and behavior. A crowd dragged him from his home, stripped, tarred, feathered, whipped, and paraded him through Boston for hours before releasing him severely injured. He later returned to Britain, so he actually survived this. And so this famous depiction, which was made in 1774 by Philip Daw, is a depiction of this event. Although it's kind of exaggerating. I mean, it combines multiple events like the Boston Tea Party, which happens in the background, and then the tarring and feathering, and shoving tea down the guy's throat. Franklin, he appears before the Privy Council, and here's a pretty cool painting of it. In order to defend Massachusetts after the Hutchinson Letters affair, in which leaked correspondence revealed Governor Thomas Hutchinson's call for curbing colonial liberties instead of a fair hearing, Franklin was subjected to a scathing verbal assault by Solicitor General Alexander Webberburn, and who denounced him as a thief and agitator. Franklin remained silent and composed throughout, later remarking that the humiliation marked his final break with Britain and solidified his commitment to the American cause. So, again, how this event is taught is that the Boston Tea Party happens, and then Franklin is in front of the Privy Council, and people think that the Privy Council was yelling at Lincoln, or not Lincoln, at Franklin for the Boston Tea Party, when in reality, it was for the Thomas Hutchinson's letters affair. So that's just clearing up the historical record. At least the popular history. And then you have the Boston Port Act. This is the first of the coercive acts, or the British called it the coercive acts. The Patriots called it the intolerable acts. And so the Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston to all maritime trade until the East India Company was compensated for the destroyed tea in the Boston Tea Party. The measure was designed to punish the colony of Massachusetts and force compliance with parliamentary authority by cutting off its primary economic lifeline. Instead of isolating Boston, however, the act generated widespread sympathy throughout the colonies and accelerated intercolonial cooperation against what many viewed as collective punishment without representation. The Virginia courts are closed with the expiration of the law that set court fees. Virginia courts closed because the Virginia Assembly cannot enact a new law before it is dissolved by Lord Dunmore. All the courts remain closed until 1776. In the meantime, creditors cannot force any action to recover their debts. While all this is going on, you have Lord Dunmore's War, which is a very brief conflict and only lasted a couple months, erupted between Virginia militia led by Governor Lord Dunmore and the Shawnee and Mingo nations over control of the Ohio Valley. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Camp Charlotte in October that year, forcing Native Americans to cede land to Virginia and intensifying colonial expansion westward. So again, one of the very first documents that we have in this chapter is the Proclamation Line of 1763. Well, most people wrongfully believe that the Proclamation Line prevented the expansion of the colonies. It really didn't. And the line itself that you see on the map was a later invention to help depict the Proclamation Line. It only protected native Allied land. And if, again, you know anything about the relations between the Native Americans and Britain at this time, most Native Americans are not allied with the British, so most Native American land is not protected by the proclamation line, and also did not actually prohibit the expansion of the colonies. It only restricted how the colonies can expand by requiring royal governors to accept or approve of any purchasing of land past the proclamation line, past the borders. And so when an incident like this, where Lord Dunmore, he's the royal governor of Virginia, allow for more land from Native Americans who aren't allied with the English to be taken, ceded from the natives, and brought to the Virginia territory. So proclamation line, not as important as what many people make it out to be. Doesn't really protect Native American land. It actually does the opposite, because in the proclamation of that, of 1763, it gives a bunch of land to the officers who fought in the French and Indian War as a reward. So that's kind of like the exact opposite of protecting native land. So I highly encourage people to actually read these primary source documents instead of just believing whatever you hear or read in textbooks or by your teachers or by educators, because the primary sources tell a very different, much more complicated story than what is currently the common myth of this time period. I mean, I call it a myth because it's not really real or accurate to reality. The current historiography of this time period is not very accurate. And so the work that we're doing at Amending America is try to clean up the historical record, at least the public understanding of the history itself, through primary sources. So I highly encourage you guys to read all of these primary source documents. Let's see. Governor Gage is made governor of Massachusetts. Thomas Gage was appointed governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, replacing civilian governance with direct military oversight in response to escalating unrest following the Boston Tea Party. His appointment signaled Britain's shift toward coercive enforcement of imperial authority through the coercive acts, the Intolerable Acts, including the closure of Boston Harbor and restructuring of colonial government. The move deepened colonial fears of military rule and further unified opposition across the colonies. Here's yet another political essay called Observations on the Act of Parliament, commonly called the Boston Port Bill, with thoughts on civil society and standing armies, written by Josiah Quincy II. He is a friend of John Adams. In fact, John Adams names his son, one of his sons, John Quincy Adams. Most likely after this guy, John Quincy. If not John Quincy the First, then John Quincy the Second. At least that's a coincidence that I saw. So, we'll see if that's actually true. Defended Boston against the punitive measures of the Boston Port Act. And so, this is yet another political essay written by a patriot against, this time, the Boston Port Act. Now you have another coercive act called the Massachusetts Government Act. As part of the coercive acts, the Massachusetts Government Act significantly altered the political structure of the province of Massachusetts Bay by limiting the authority of its elected assembly and increasing the power of the royal governor, Thomas Gage. The act restricted town meetings, centralized appointments under the crown, and effectively placed colonial governance under tighter imperial control. Colonists widely viewed it as an attack on representative government itself, and it helped accelerate coordinated resistance across the American colonies. You have the Third Intolerable Act, which is the Administration of Justice Act. As part of the Coercive Acts, the Administration of Justice Act followed British officials, allowed British officials and soldiers accused of capital crimes in the province of Massachusetts Bay to be tried in other colonies or in Britain if a fair trial could not be obtained locally. The measure was intended by Parliament to protect imperial officers from hostile colonial juries, but it was widely condemned in America as the Murder Act because it appeared to permit officials to evade justice for actions committed in the colonies. The law further deepened colonial fears that British governance was abandoning impartial legal principles in favor of protecting imperial authority. Virginia passes a resolution to fast and pray for Boston. And so this is going to be a very common thing throughout this period, and then going into the American Revolution, where you have these fasting and prayers for the colonial cause. Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore will dissolve. Excuse me. I've been talking for almost 3 hours straight. So, this is much longer than even the other chapters. And we're not done yet. We still have a lot of this material to cover. So let's see. Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore dissolves the House of Burgesses. That's the Virginia General Assembly. After it defied royal authority by passing resolutions condemning the British Coercive Acts. And so that includes, let's see, I believe that includes the Virginia Resolution to Fast and Prayer. And that's what Dunmore is freaking out about. Virginia calls for the Continental Congress. And so you have another typo, geez. It's supposed to be the with one T, not two. So the dissolved Virginia House of Burgesses, meeting informally at the Riley Tavern in Williamsburg, adopted resolutions calling for a Continental Congress of colonial delegates to coordinate a unified response to the coercive acts. The proposal was advanced by leaders such as Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, and it urged all colonies to consult together on measures of readiness. This marked a decisive step toward intercolonial political unity and set in motion the convening of the First Continental Congress later that year. The Virginia Day of Fasting for Boston. This is part of the Virginia Resolution for Fasting of Boston and praying for Boston. Now you have the Quartering Act of the Intolerable Acts, not the Quartering Act of 1765. And this expanded the British government's authority to house and supply troops stationed in the American colonies. It allowed military commanders to request accommodations in unoccupied buildings such as inns, barns, and other structures if barracks were insufficient, increasing the presence and visibility of British soldiers in colonial towns. Colonists widely viewed the measure as an infringement on property rights and an extension of military coercion, reinforcing fears of standing army enforcement in civilian governance. And then you have the final Intolerable Act. Some people don't include this in the Intolerable Acts. We do, which is the Quebec Act, which restructured governance in the former French territory of Canada, establishing a centralized administration under British rule while preserving French civil law and guaranteeing freedom of Catholic worship. The act also expanded the territorial boundaries of Quebec southward into the Ohio River Valley, a move that alarmed many of the American colonies who had competing land claims in the region. Although intended by Britain to stabilize governance in Canada After the 7 Years' War, colonists viewed it as a broader pattern of imperial overreach that restricted their widespread expansion and altered the constitutional balance of the empire. So, back to the discussion of the proclamation line of 1763, which people give credit, wrongfully give credit, as restricting the boundary. Doesn't restrict the boundary for colonial expansion. The Quebec Act does, however. And so, if you're going to talk about restricting the expansion of the colonies that already exist, you need to be looking at the Quebec Act, not the Royal Proclamation line of 1763. Here's the Fairfax Resolves. Excuse me. A convention of Virginia leaders meeting at Williamsburg adopted the Fairfax Resolves, drafted primarily by George Mason. The Resolves asserted that colonists possessed the same ancient and inestimable rights as Englishmen, including taxation only by their own representatives, and condemned the coercive acts as unconstitutional violations of those liberties. They also called for a Continental Congress to coordinate colonial resistance, marking an important step toward unified intercolonial political action. So this will lead to the First Continental Congress. The First Virginia Convention meets in Williamsburg, elected in June and July following the Assembly's dissolution by the governor. Delegates adopt an association that bans the importation and sale of British goods, including slaves, after November 1st, 1774, and exports to Britain after August 10th, 1775. They also elect 7 delegates to the First Continental Congress, including Peyton Randolph, Richard Henry Lee, George Washington, and Patrick Henry. Here is a summary view of the rights of British America, a political essay that I mentioned before. This is written by Thomas Jefferson, and in it, it's a political essay, but it's written as a resolution that could be easily adopted and passed by the First Continental Congress. And so Thomas Jefferson is writing this to kind of get his name out there, but also as a resource that he hopes the First Continental Congress will use, which they don't, at least in the First Continental Congress, but it does make him popular. And for the Second Continental Congress, he will be chosen to write the Declaration of Independence. General Gage moves gunpowder to Boston. British troops removed the king's powder from a magazine in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and took 2 cannons from Cambridge and brought it to Boston for safekeeping. And so there are some murmurs going around about the British taking gunpowder from the colonists. This is not true. The British were only taking the gunpowder that was owned by the king, the king's powder, as it's called. So they weren't taking the people's powder, the people of Massachusetts. They were only taking the king's powder. And this would lead to the false powder alarm. Rumors of bloodshed the previous day led Massachusetts Minutemen to gather. They disperse when reality sets in. So General Gage, he moves the powder to Boston because he fears it might get taken. And that event will be a false alarm for the Minutemen of Massachusetts. But now the Minutemen of Massachusetts have the idea of taking their own powder that is in these magazines, which is like this large stone building to keep powder safe and secure and dry. It is they decide to take the powder, that's the powder of the militia of Massachusetts, and hide it all over towns, all over Massachusetts. And so this false powder alarm will lead to that, and then that will eventually lead to pretty quickly to the battles of Lexington and Concord, which I'm about to talk about. So we have the First Continental Congress from September 5th to October 26, 1774. Meeting in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. This meeting took place in I'm trying to remember the name of the building. Carpenter's Hall. It is a couple blocks away from Independence Hall, and it is a very interesting building. It is the home of the Carpenters Guild, the Carpenters Company in Philadelphia. They are the people who actually built the building, the Independence Hall, and so it's interesting to see that connection, because during this time, Independence Hall is the capital of not only Philadelphia, the city, but Pennsylvania, the colony. And so the people who meet here are from 12 colonies to coordinate a response to the coercive acts imposed by Massachusetts following the Boston Tea Party. So this is a replica of the Stamp Act Congress. They're meeting to create a petition. This time, instead of it being the Stamp Act, it is the Intolerable Acts. The Congress adopted declarations of colonial rights, organized economic sanctions through the Continental Association, and issued addresses to the King and the British people and the inhabitants of Quebec, seeking redress of colonial grievances. Although the delegates still sought reconciliation within the British Empire rather than independence, the Congress marked a major step toward intercolonial unity and the creation of a common American political identity. And so the address to the people of Great Britain is one of the petitions passed by the First Continental Congress. You have the Suffolk Resolves, declared that the coercive acts were unconstitutional and called on Massachusetts colonists to refuse obedience to British authority. Drafted under the leadership of Joseph Warren, they urged economic boycotts, the organization of militia, and the resignation of royal officials. Endorsed by the First Continental Congress, the resolves marked a decisive shift from protest to organized resistance, laying groundwork for the American Revolution. Now, the First Continental Congress endorses the Suffolk Resolves on September 17th, 1774, so about a week after the Resolves. And this is delivered by Paul Revere. The First Continental Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves. So this is made in Massachusetts, and then it gets delivered by Paul Revere to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. This is Galloway. He is a member of the First Continental Congress, Joseph Galloway. He is a loyalist, so he does not join the Patriots when the Revolution happens. And he proposed a plan to preserve the British Empire through constitutional reform rather than confrontation. His proposal called for the creation of an American Grand Council elected by the colonial assemblies that would work alongside Parliament and the Crown, appointed President General with imperial legislation affecting the colonies requiring the consent of both bodies. Although the plan was narrowly defeated and later removed from the official records of the Congress, it represented one of the last major attempts to reconcile colonial self-government with continued membership in the British Empire. Thomas Gage, the governor of Massachusetts, dissolves the Massachusetts Assembly. Again, Governor and military commander Thomas Gage dissolved the Massachusetts General Court in accordance with the provisions of the Massachusetts Government Act, which had sharply curtailed colonial self-government. Rather than ending political resistance, the dissolution prompted many representatives to reconvene independently as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress under the leadership of figures such as John Hancock. This transition from royal institutions to parallel revolutionary governments marked a significant escalation in the constitutional crisis and moved Massachusetts closer to open rebellion. Oh, things are starting to get really heated. Massachusetts Provincial Congress meets in Concord. Delegates from across Massachusetts gathered in Salem, despite orders from Governor Gage that the General Court, the Colonial Assembly, should not meet there. They elected delegates and officers and declared themselves a new governing body, Massachusetts Provincial Congress. The John Hancock was chosen chairman, effectively the president of the Massachusetts Congress. And then the First Continental Congress will pass the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. This is a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, where you have a list of grievances, and they're sending it to the king to resolve. Of course, under the Declaration of Independence, instead of sending the grievances for the king to resolve, it's notifying the king that because the grievances were not resolved, that we are seceding from the British Empire. Dartmouth, Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, sends a circular letter to all colonial royal governors informing them of an order in council based on a law passed by George II's reign prohibiting the importation of weapons, ammunition, and gunpowder into the colonies for the next 6 months, and restructuring and instructing governors to secure any that are suspected. And so this is a circular letter going around to all the royal governors telling them to secure weapons and gunpowder. One of the last documents from the First Continental Congress includes the Continental Association. This is the agreement. It's a unified system of economic sanctions against Great Britain in response to the Intolerable Acts, the Coercive Acts. The agreement called for the cessation of imports of British goods beginning in December of 1774, and the suspension of exports to Britain if grievances remained unresolved, and the discouragement of consumption of imported products. Local committees were established throughout the colonies to enforce compliance, making the association one of the first continent-wide institutions of American self-government and an important step toward political union. So this is a precursor to what would be the Second Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation. You have the petition to repeal the Intolerable Acts. This is one of the last documents of the First Continental Congress. That is a petition to repeal the Coercive Acts of England, the 5 acts that I already mentioned. And interesting enough, Yorktown will have its own Tea Party, although not as famous as the Boston Tea Party from a year prior. And learning that the merchant ship Virginia, lying in York River, has in its hold 2 half chests of tea consigned to a Williamsburg merchant. Angry citizens board the ship, then immediately hoisted the tea out of the hold and threw it into the river. Merchants will support the Continental Association in Virginia. Almost 500 Williamsburg merchants sign the Continental Association and present it to Peyton Randolph. The Restraining Act is passed in Parliament. Or Restraining Acts, there's 2 of them. These 2 acts passed by Parliament of Great Britain, which limited colonial trade in response to both increasing and spreading of civil disobedience in Massachusetts and New England, and similar trade restrictions instituted by elected colonial representatives. The first of these would receive royal assent on March 30th, 1775, becoming known as the New England Restraining Act. The second would receive royal assent on April 13th, 1775, and would expand the trade restrictions in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina in retaliation to the Continental Association of the First Continental Congress. George III opens the new Parliament with a speech on rebellion in Massachusetts. So the king opens the newly elected Parliament, in which many people had placed great hopes for reconciliation, with a speech that declares he is obliged to inform you, the people of Parliament, that a most daring spirit of resistance and disobedience of the law still unhappily prevails. So the king is now getting involved, and instead of fixing the issue and trying to reconcile both sides, Parliament and the colonies, he is now urging Parliament to take more drastic measures against reconciliation in order to strengthen the authority of the king and Parliament. So the king is getting involved at the worst time possible and will prevent reconciliation from happening. And so this section of the timeline is called the Conciliation Crisis because of it. Because of the king. Maryland convention will urge men to join the militia. Meeting in Annapolis, delegates to Maryland's convention urge all men between 16 and 50 to serve in the provincial militia and to be in readiness to act on any emergency. So now the colonies are preparing their militias. A interesting debate happens via letters, public letters published in newspapers, called the Massachusettsiensis and the Jonathan Sewall, or Massachusettsiensis by Jonathan Sewall begins publication. A series of 17 essays written by Jonathan Sewall, a childhood friend of John Adams, which argued in favor of the Loyalist side, and John Adams would take up the pen and write a series of essays in response called Novanglus. Novanglus just means New England in Latin. And so this interesting debate between these two friends, one a Loyalist, one a Patriot, about the issues going on in the American colonies. And you have Paul Revere, his midday ride, as opposed to the midnight ride, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Paul Revere warns of British intention to seize powder. I wonder if that sounds familiar. And the militia decide to raid Fort William and Mary. Because Paul Revere's warning of British intention to seize powder, the local militia raided the fort and smuggled gunpowder away from the coast. And so, before the British were just taking the king's powder away from the magazines that was shared with the people's powder, now the militia is taking the king's powder and hiding it in the colonies, and they're also hiding their own powder. And so this raid of Fort William and Mary will lead to the powder conflict, which will lead to Lexington and Concord, which will lead to the siege of Boston, which will lead to the American Revolution, and so on and so forth. So everything is one thing that leads to the next thing. That's kind of how history works. Full vindication of measures of Congress. This is the first published essay by Alexander Hamilton regarding the conflict in the Americas. And so in this essay, he is defending the actions of the First Continental Congress. Captain Cochrane's disposition on the raid of Fort William and Mary. This is the primary source that we use for the raid on Fort William and Mary. Dartmouth, the Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of, Colonial Affairs in Great Britain, passes a circular letter to the governors to prevent the Second Continental Congress from happening. So now Parliament and the royal governors are trying to prevent the Second Continental Congress from convening. Like I said, Novanglus, but written by John Adams, will begin its publication, which is this debate between Massachusettsiensis, written by Jonathan Sewall, who is a loyalist, and so it's just this debate. And the debate ends like days after, or days before, the Lexington and Concord in early April, which is interesting timing. Parliament declares Massachusetts in open rebellion. So this is the official start of the rebellion, at least recognized by Parliament. So British Parliament formally recognized, or formally declared, that the colony of the province of Massachusetts Bay was in a state of rebellion, citing continued resistance to the coercive acts. The Farmer Refuted by Alexander Hamilton is yet another political essay written by Hamilton, and this is in response to loyalist essays. So, Hamilton, decade later, will write the Federalist Papers, and the Federalist Papers are not a, you know, independent publication of ideas. It's actually part of a wider debate going on. So it's interesting to see Alexander Hamilton and many of the people who would participate in the constitutional debates are getting their practice debating each other and writing essays during and leading up to the American Revolution. So this is interesting to see that happen. And then you have the conciliatory resolution passed by Parliament, and this is the final attempt of Parliament to reconcile peacefully with the American colonies. Sadly, this does not, not really sadly. Sadly for Parliament, this does not work out. Colonel Alexander Leslie goes to Salem, Massachusetts to seize powder and guns. Salem's militia slowed down the colonel's advance and hid the powder and cannons. Colonel Leslie returned without seizing anything. Here's an interesting essay written by Thomas Paine called African Slavery in America. And in it, he condemns slavery in the United States. So Thomas Paine is an abolitionist. Then you have the Second Virginia Convention, which convenes at St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, where Patrick Henry gives a stirring speech that strongly condemns British authority in support of strengthening Virginia's defenses. Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament, will give his speech on conciliation, on whether or not Parliament can actually move forward with reconciling with the American colonies peacefully. And it is during the Second Virginia Convention, at least around there, that, during the convention, that this is when Patrick Henry gives his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. So this shows you the context of that happening. Then you have the first New England Restraining Act. This act was written months prior, but it only got its approval by the king on March 30th, 1775. This restricted trade in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island to only with Great Britain and the British West Indies, along with restricting fisheries. Lord Dunmore will pass this proclamation, attempting to stop the appointment of delegates to the Second Continental Congress. And so, this is trying to enforce Lord Dartmouth's circular letter by proclaiming to Virginians that he is commanded by the king to require all magistrates and other officers to use their utmost endeavors to prevent any such appointment of deputies. No officers respond, and Dunmore takes no other action. So the inefficiency to enforce the will of the king and Parliament is not going to help out the British side. And then you have the Second Restraining Act, which extended trade restrictions to of the First Restraining Act, the New England Restraining Act, and this included pretty much all the colonies at this point, any colony that was part of the Continental Association, including New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina, on top of the other colonies mentioned in the First Restraining Act. Thomas Gage receives Dartmouth letter urging action. In Boston, Lieutenant General Thomas Gage reads Lord Dartmouth's secret January 27th letter, informing him that reinforcements are on the way, leaving the only question for Gage to be in what manner the force under your command may be exerted to defend the Constitution of Britain and to restore the vigor of government in New England, including the arrest of the principal actors and abettors in Massachusetts Provincial Congress. However, Lord Dartmouth adds, after all I have said, this is a matter which must be left to your own discretion to be executed or not. And during this time, we have the Pennsylvania Abolition Society being established. So slavery is an issue. It's not the number one issue. It's not the issue in the forefront of this time period, but it is an issue. It is being discussed. It's being discussed by high-ranking society members, and progress is being done towards abolition during this time. So again, the idea that the American Revolution was done to preserve slavery is an unfounded idea, because while you have some Southerners talking about slavery and wanting to preserve it, they're not talking about that as a reason to rebel against the British. And at the same time, you have many Northerners, like mostly in Pennsylvania, who are doing things like starting the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which is advocating for abolition. And you have people like Thomas Paine, who is an abolitionist. You have other people. You had Virginia, which was trying to restrict the slave trade, and was forced by the king and Parliament to open up the slave trade. And so I just don't see that much evidence for the argument that America was founded to preserve slavery. So, the evidence just doesn't show that. Now we get to battles of Lexington and Concord. Oh boy, we're still not done with this section, and it's been almost 3 hours and 20 minutes. Oh boy. We're getting close though. We're almost over. So let's try to get through this. So Paul Revere and Dawes, I forget his first name, leave Boston and ride to Lexington. So they are leaving Boston. Paul Revere goes north to Medford, crossing the Mystic River, and then here. And then Dawes goes south through Roxbury, Brookline, across Cambridge Bridge, and then to here. And the British, they do something weird. They go by boat, travel to the land, and then they walk all the way over here. And so Revere and Dawes reach Lexington before British leave Lichmere Point. Dr. Prescott joins them, so it's 3 men. Here, I have it here on the timeline. At 12:30 a.m., so just after noon. Oh no, in the morning. Just after midnight, Revere and Dawes arrive at Lexington. At Lexington, Samuel Adams and John Hancock are warned of the British plans to seize local supplies, and then leaving Lexington, Prescott joins them to ride to Concord. Other riders were sent out to nearby towns to spread the alarm and muster the Minutemen. At 1:30 a.m., around 1:30 a.m., these aren't exact times, British patrol arrest Paul Revere. Dawes returns to Lexington, while Prescott was the only rider to reach Concord. The British begin their march from Boston to Concord. Cold and wet, after crossing the water west of Boston, the British troops begin their 16-mile march to Concord. At 4:30 a.m., Minutemen prepare for the British to arrive. Captain Parker of Lexington armed his militia and prepared to meet the British infantry on the path to Concord. Parker is known to have proclaimed to his militia, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Then you have the Battle of Lexington, which wasn't really a battle, it was a very brief skirmish where no British soldiers died. And so British forces confronted the militia on Lexington Green. Parker's men, outnumbered, began to withdraw from the British line. However, when a gunshot from an unknown source went off, the British and militiamen engaged in a volley of shots, wounding one British soldier and killing 8 Minutemen. At 7 a.m., British arrive at Concord. British forces search the town for weapons, ammo, cannons, and other supplies, but find very little. At 9:30, the Battle of Northbridge, which is the Battle of Concord, seeing smoke rising from Concord, Minutemen arrive near the town at the North Bridge, where they fire upon British troops. The first British troops killed by colonial militia died here at Concord. So this is a battle. British retreat starting at noon and retreat from Concord, and they go back to Boston, and they do it in 7.5 hours. So from noon to 7:30 p.m. Local time, they make it back to Boston. The Minutemen harass the British regulars all the way back to Boston in a number of skirmishes, turning the 15-mile retreat into a bloody affair. British casualties totaled 273, 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. Colonial casualties totaled 95, 49 killed, 41 wounded, and 5 missing. And at 4 p.m., the siege of Boston begins as the last British troops abandon Charleston and cross the water to Boston. The 11th month siege of Boston begins. And then you have the Williamsburg gunpowder incident. So pretty similar to what the British were attempting to do at Lexington and Concord, except without fighting. So Lord Dunmore orders 15 half barrels of gunpowder to be removed from the Williamsburg magazine during the night of the 20th. The people of the town were enraged once news spread, but Petton, Randolph, and others calmed them. Over the next few days, hundreds of men from the surrounding countryside organize under Patrick Henry and march on Williamsburg. Dunmore's family flees to a British warship, while the governor claims he was securing the gunpowder from a rumored slave revolt, which is an interesting excuse. The crisis ends on May 4th when Carter Braxton arranges to pay Henry for the gunpowder on behalf of the colony. Patrick Henry marches on Williamsburg. Patrick Henry, leading a contingent of militiamen from Hanover and surrounding counties, marched toward Williamsburg with the intent to confront Dunmore and demand compensation for the seized gunpowder. The confrontation did not result in fighting. Dunmore agreed to pay for the powder, diffusing the immediate crisis, but the incident significantly heightened tensions between Virginia colonists and royal authority. And then, the Second Continental Congress convenes, and they convene on the same day as Fort Ticonderoga being captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold on May 10th, 1775. So the Second Continental Congress convened in Philly amid escalating armed conflict following the battles of Lexington and Concord. Unlike the First Continental Congress, which sought reconciliation, this session was immediately confronted with the reality of war and the need to coordinate collective defense among the colonies. The Congress began assuming governmental functions, including organizing military forces and managing colonial resistance, while still formally professing loyalty to the British Crown. And of course, Fort Ticonderoga is captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold shortly after the outbreak of the armed conflict between Britain and the American colonies. And the fort was seized with minimal resistance and provided the colonial forces with valuable artillery, which will help at the siege of Boston. British General William Howe arrives in Boston with reinforcements. William Howe will be the first commander of British forces of the American Revolution, and he is supported by his subordinates, Henry Clinton, John Burgoyne, and others. But these are the most important generals of the American Revolution. William Howe is the first commander-in-chief of British forces. He will then be replaced by Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne will actually be defeated at the Battle of Saratoga. And then Clinton will be the commander-in-chief of British forces for the rest of the war after Howe. And his subordinate, Cornwallis, will be the one to surrender at Yorktown, but that's going to be the next chapter. We have the letter to the inhabitants of Canada, passed by the Second Continental Congress. This is a letter trying to encourage the inhabitants of Canada, mostly Quebec, to rebel or to join the Continental Congress in protesting against the British. Not yet rebellion, but the colonists are trying to get other colonies to join the fighting. The original 13 colonies are trying to get other colonies, because there's more than just 13 colonies, to join the conflict. You have the Charlottetown resolves. Local leaders in Charlotte, in the province of North Carolina, reportedly adopted what became known as the Mecklenburg Resolves, or the Charlottetown Resolves, a set of declarations asserting that British authority had effectively been dissolved in the colony, and that local self-government should take its place. The resolves reflected escalating colonial resistance following the outbreak of the armed conflict in Massachusetts, and expressed the view that the Crown's policies had nullified traditional constitutional ties. So, is this document a legitimate document? Should this be considered the first instance of independence? I don't think so. But it is evidence that the movement towards independence and the rebellion, the revolution, was not a top-down thing. It was very much bottom-up, because we have all these local communities who are passing these resolves. This is just the first one, for arguing for independence. And so the federal government of the colonies, the Second Continental Congress, will be the last entity to accept independence, pretty much the last one. So it's not the top, which is the Second Continental Congress, trying to force the people into a rebellion. It's very much the people demanding that their representatives in the colonies, and then also in the Second Continental Congress, to go and support independence. Lord Dunmore, he flees Williamsburg, fearing that that Williamsburg is not safe for him because of Patrick Henry's march. Virginia rejects the conciliatory resolution. The conciliatory resolution is the resolution passed by Parliament, passed by Parliament, trying to be a peaceful reconciliation with the colonies, by allowing very nominal representation of the colonies and not addressing any of the actual complaints and grievances that the colonists had. And then you have British General Thomas Gage declares Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. Remarks on the Quebec Bill. This is another essay by Alexander Hamilton. So it's interesting. He's like he's not a kid. He's like a young adult. He's in college, and he's writing these political essays, and which is kind of cool. Washington's acceptance speech as commander-in-chief. So, On June 15th, Washington is elected as Commander-in-Chief. On June 16th, he gives his acceptance speech. And then you have the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 14th, 1775. This is during the Siege of Boston. Then here's Washington's commission as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Forces. And then in July 2nd, 1775, Washington arrives in Boston as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The Second Continental Congress will pass a declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms. This is the Second Continental Congress's attempt at justifying what happened at Lexington and Concord, while also trying to reconcile with Parliament. In fact, the attempt at reconciliation by the colonists in response to Parliament's attempt at reconciliation is the Olive Branch Petition. And right when that is being sent, Admiral Howe, which is General Howe's brother, arrives in North America with a large fleet of warships and reinforcements. And then the Second Continental Congress will pass the report on the conciliatory resolution, which is to refuse and disagree with the Conciliatory Act of Parliament. And now, finally, after 3.5 hours, oh man, we get to the last thing in this chapter, and that is a copy of the Olive Branch, so not the Olive Branch Petition itself, but a copy of the Olive Branch Petition arrives in London, issued by the Second Continental Congress, arrived in London for consideration by British officials and the King. The petition, drafted primarily by John Dickinson and addressed to George III, reaffirmed colonial loyalty and requested royal intervention to restore constitutional harmony between Parliament and the colonies. By the time it reached London, however, British political sentiment had hardened significantly following the outbreak of armed conflict at Lexington, Concord, and the ongoing siege of Boston. The petition was effectively dismissed, and the Crown proceeded with plans to suppress what is now formally regarded as an armed rebellion, marking the end of serious prospects for reconciliation. So that's why this blue section on this timeline is called the Conciliation Crisis, because it's all about trying to reconcile, but failing. And that is the end of this chapter. This is chapter 4 of the compendium. This is the first chapter of the Revolutionary Era, first of 2. The next chapter, chapter 5, which is the second chapter of the Revolutionary Era, is going to cover the War for Independence itself, which will be the next 8 years, almost 9 years, of the conflict, the imperial crisis, the revolution itself. And I'll be doing a live stream tomorrow to talk about chapter 5. So, for those who were here with me, and for any of those who watch this in the future, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new about our old history. What we do is as an educational nonprofit, is build this resource, which is the compendium, which includes these interactive timelines that I've been using. And this is free to use and free to access on our website, www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled Tarpeia, and we are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible. Consider that. And if you want to donate a decent amount of money, you can reach out to me. Like, if you want to make a large one-time payment, you can reach out to me via my email, which is Mark with a K at Tarpeia, Tarpeia.us, and I can give you information about our charity that you'll need if you're donating through a donor advised fund or something like that, like our EIN and our address. And so, yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this live stream. This has been the longest live stream so far, over 3.5 hours, just to cover one chapter, just to summarize one chapter of our compendium. So, we have a ton more history to cover, and I will be doing so every single day for the next 22 days, because there's 26 chapters, and we just finished the fourth chapter right now. And so, yeah, again, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. And if you like what we do, and you think that this is a valuable resource for teachers and students and scholars and anyone interested in learning about our history, especially by looking at primary sources, then you can support us uh, numerous ways. We're looking for volunteers, we're looking for donors, we're looking for people to help network with other people, other content creators, other researchers, and schools and universities and stuff like that. So if you want to learn more about us, just reach out to me and I'll be happy to explain in more detail what we do. So thank you and have a nice day, and I hope to see you tomorrow.